The courthouse bell had not yet struck noon when Grace Hawthorne's brother shoved her into the muddy street and said, "Loud enough for half of Calder Creek to hear. You expect any decent man to choose her?" The rain had turned the town road black and slick. The wagon ruts filled vey-kept-tay hat brown water that reflected the grey sky like broken glass. Men gathered beneath the awning of the mercantile. Women stood in the church doorway pretending not to stare. A pair of boys laughed behind a hitching post until their mother pinched them silent. Grace stood in the centre of it all with her best dress soaked at the hem, one glove split at the thumb, and a folded marriage advertisement clenched in her fist like it was the last dry thing left in the world. Her brother, Silas Hawthorne, held a leather ledger under one arm and a court notice in the other hand. He had shaved that morning, Grace noticed, because he always shaved before doing something cruel. Clean face. Clean collar. Clean smile. The notice was not about her. That was the part nobody understood yet. It named a widower named Ethan Mercer, a mountain man from the North Ridge, and warned that unless he could prove a proper household before the winter custody hearing, his 2 young sons could be removed and placed under the guardianship of their maternal grandmother, Mrs. Adelaide Whit. The whole town had whispered over it for 3 days. A man who lived among timber, snow and wolves was expected to find a wife before the circuit judge arrived. A wife on paper. A mother in the eyes of the law. A shield against a woman with money and polished grief. Grace had come to town because her family told her there was work at the hotel laundry. Instead, Silas had dragged her to the church steps and announced that if any desperate bachelor wanted a woman who ate too much, spoke too little, and came with no dowry, he could take her before the Hawthornes wasted another winter feeding her. People laughed. Not all of them. Enough. Then Ethan Mercer stepped out of the land office with snow melt on his boots, a scar along his jaw, and a rifle strap crossing one shoulder. He had a court paper in his coat pocket and the stillness of a man who had spent too many nights listening for danger in the trees. His gaze moved from Silas to Grace, then to the folded advertisement in her hand. He did not smile. He did not pity her. He simply said, "Mutluk choose her." The street went silent so quickly that Grace could hear rain ticking against the brim of Ethan's hat. Silas blinked. "You don't mean that." Ethan looked at him. What don't he waste words? Mrs. Whitcomb, who had been watching from a carriage near the courthouse, leaned forward behind her black veil. Her gloved fingers tightened around a silver-handled cane. Grace saw it. So did Ethan, and for one strange second, Grace wondered whether this quiet mountain man had chosen her because he needed a wife, or because he had seen something in that carriage that frightened him more than a lonely life. Grace Hawthorne had learned early that shame had a sound. It was not always shouting. Sometimes it was the little cough a woman made behind a hand when Grace squeezed past a pew. Sometimes it was the chair leg scraped aside before she sat, as if her body were an inconvenience the whole room had to prepare for. Sometimes it was her mother sighing over a bolt of fabric and saying there was no sense wasting good blue cotton on a girl shaped like a flour sack. That morning, shame sounded like rain, Sehatura Sehat bells, and her brother S voice. "Ethan Mercer," Silas said, laughing now because he needed the town to laugh with him. "You must be colder up on that ridge than folks say if you re willing to drag my sister home." A few men under the mercantile awning chuckled. Ethan did not look at them. He looked at Grace. "You can say no," he said. Those 4 words landed harder than the insult. Grace's throat tightened. No one in her family asked what she wanted. They told her where to stand, what to mend, what not to eat, when to disappear, and how grateful she ought to be that they tolerated her. A choice, even a strange and frightening one, felt like a door opening in a house she had believed had no doors. She looked past Ethan toward the carriage. Mrs. Whitcomb was still watching. The older woman's face was pale and composed beneath her veil, but her eyes were sharp with calculation. Beside her sat Mr. Leland Voss, the banker, a narrow man with oiled hair and a gold watch chain stretched across his vest. He had been in the land office with Ethan. He held a document folder against his knee and spoke quietly to Mrs. Whitcomb without taking his eyes off the street. Grace noticed documents the way other women noticed hats. She had spent 6 years keeping accounts for her father's grain store after his hands began to tremble too much to write. She knew the weight of ledgers, the crease of folded receipts, the difference between honest ink and ink laid down after a man had changed his mind. She knew when a banker held papers like property and when he held them like a weapon. Mr. Voss held that folder like a weapon. Silas stepped close enough that Grace smelled peppermint on his breath. "Don't make a spectacle of yourself," he muttered. "He's only doing this to keep his brats. You'll be a servant with a ring." Grace lifted her eyes to him. "A servant would be paid," she said. The chuckles stopped again. Silas' face darkened. Ethan's mouth did not move, but something in his eyes changed. Not amusement, not admiration. Recognition, perhaps, as if he had heard a tool strike true against iron. The church door opened with a groan, and Reverend Cole stepped into the rain holding his Bible beneath his coat. "Mr. Mercer," the Reverend called carefully, "this is no small matter. Marriage is not a paper fence to stand before a judge." "No," Ethan said. "It isn't tea." Grace turned toward him. "Then why ask me?" The question came out steadier than she felt. Rain slipped down Ethan's hat brim. He was taller than most men in town, broad through the shoulders from axe work, but not showy with it. His coat was worn at the cuffs. His gloves had been patched more than once. He looked like a man who repaired what he owned instead of replacing it. "Mott have 2 boys," he said. "Samuel is 8. Caleb is 5. Their mother died 2 winters ago. Her mother says my cabin is unfit, my work too rough, and my name too poor to keep them. Judge Harlan will hear it in 3 weeks. Grace heard the whole town listening. Ethan went on. "Mort need a lawful wife before then. Someone willing to stand in my house and say the boys are cared for. I want to lie about Mott met asking. I want promise softness Mott don't have. Mott can offer a roof, food, protection, and my name. In return, Mort ask help keeping my sons where they belong." His honesty should have made the bargain uglier. It did not. It gave it edges Grace could see. Silas snorted. "You forgot to mention that your roof leaks. Your north pasture is mortgaged, and every woman in 3 counties has had the sense to refuse you." Ethan's gaze flicked toward him. "You know a great deal about my affairs." "Mr." Voss stepped down from the carriage before Silas could answer. "Everyone knows." "Mr. Mercer," the banker said smoothly. "A man's debts are not exactly private when he borrows against land he may soon lose." Ethan's jaw tightened. Grace watched Voss open the folder just enough for the top page to show. Not fully, just enough to remind Ethan of what was inside. That was deliberate. Mrs. Whitcomb remained in the carriage, but her voice carried through the rain like a needle through cloth. "Mr. Mercer, you cannot mend neglect with a hasty ceremony. My daughter is dead. Mott will not see her sons raised by desperation, and some unfortunate woman purchased in the street." Grace felt the words strike her. Unfortunate woman. Purchased. Ethan turned slowly toward the carriage. "You've said your piece." "Mrs. Whitcomb." Mott have hardly begun. "No," he said. "You began when you filed papers against me without once riding up to see whether the boys were fed." Colour rose in the older woman's cheeks. Voss cleared his throat. "Careful. Mercer. Grief deserves respect. So do fathers." The rain thickened. Grace should have walked away. A sensible woman would have. She had no reason to step into another person's war. She had no reason to trust a mountain man who needed her name more than her heart. She had no reason to trade the Hawthorne house where cruelty wore familiar boots for a ridge cabin full of strangers' debt and judgment. But then she saw two small faces watching from inside the freight wagon beside the livery. The boys. The older one sat stiff-backed, their kepi dark hair falling over serious eyes. The younger clutched a carved wooden horse against his chest. Both wore coats too thin for the weather. Both stared at the adults with the silent terror of children who know their lives are being decided by people standing above them. Grace knew that terror. She had lived beneath it for years. Ethan followed her gaze. For the first time, something like pain moved across his face. "They re yours?" she asked quietly. "Yes. Do they know what's happening?" His answer was a long time coming. Enough. That settled something in her. Not love. Not trust. Something older. A refusal. Grace turned to Reverend Cole. "If Mott agree, can the ceremony be done today?" The Reverend looked startled. "Child, you should consider." Mott have considered standing in the mud while men discuss my worth. Her hand tightened around the folded advertisement. Mott have considered returning to a house where my labour is welcome and my presence is not. Mott have considered those boys watching a carriage decide where they sleep. If Mr. Mercer keeps his word, Mott can keep mine. Silas grabbed her arm. Grace. Ethan moved before Grace could pull free. He did not touch Silas. He only stepped close enough that Silas released her. "Don't put your hand on her again," Ethan said. It was not loud. That made it worse. Silas swallowed, then smirked to save himself. "Take her, then. But don't come back complaining when she eats you poor and breaks your chairs." A ripple of mean laughter rose and died uneasily. Grace felt heat flood her face. She had promised herself long ago not to cry where people could enjoy it. She kept that promise now. Her eyes burned, but her chin stayed level. Ethan looked at Silas for one cold second. Then he looked at Grace. "Do you have belongings?" "A trunk at my brother S. house." "What S in it?" "2 dresses. Account books. Sewing things. My mother S. skillet. And a quilt Mort made." Silas barked a laugh. "Those account books belong to the store." Grace did not look away from Ethan. "The store books do. Mine don tea." Ethan nodded once. "We look get the trunk." Silas shifted. "No. You won tea. She owes us board." Grace's stomach clenched. There it was. The hook in the bait. Silas lifted the ledger under his arm. 3 years of room. Meals. Cloth. Coal. And church dues. You want her. Mercer, you can settle what she owes. Murmurs moved through the crowd. Grace stared at the ledger. She knew that book, brown calfskin, brass corners, 1 broken strap. She had entered numbers in it for years, but not the ones Silas was claiming. The Hawthorne store owed her wages from long before her father died. Her brother had promised to settle once accounts improved. Accounts never improved when a man drank profit and called it loss. Ethan said, "How much?" Grace turned sharply. "No." Silas opened the ledger with theatrical care. $46.70. "That S false," Grace said. The words were soft. Triumphant. Grace felt the trap close. Her proof was in her trunk. Her own small account book, wrapped in oilcloth beneath the quilt, held every unpaid week, every invoice copied, every supplier S receipt she had balanced after Silas misplaced the originals. If he kept the trunk, he kept the proof. If Ethan paid, the town would believe she had been a burden bought off like damaged. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "You said she owed board. You have signed charges." Silas tapped the ledger. Right here. Grace looked at the open page. Rain speckled the ink before Silas tilted it away. But she had seen enough. The entries were too neat. All in the same hand. All written recently. Her pulse slowed. That was the lie. May Mort see it? She asked. Silas smiled. No, because the ink is fresh. His smile faltered. The crowd stirred. Grace took one step forward because you wrote 3 years of charges after breakfast and forgot that father changed ink suppliers last spring. Anything older than 9 months would be brown-black, not blue-black. And because you listed church dues in February when Reverend Cole closed the church 2 Sundays from snow and took no collection. Reverend Cole's brows lifted. Silas snapped the ledger shut. You always did think yourself clever. No, Grace said. Mott learned numbers because someone had to keep you honest. A sound moved through the street. Not laughter this time, but surprise. Ethan looked at the ledger, then at Grace. He did not praise her. Somehow that felt better. Praise could be another kind of ownership when given by the wrong person. He simply said, Get her trunk. Silas backed up half a step. You have no authority in my house. Mott will in an hour. Mrs. Whitcomb's cane struck the carriage floor. This is disgraceful. Grace turned toward her. No, ma'am. It was disgraceful before Mott answered. The older woman's lips parted. For the first time that morning, nobody laughed. Reverend Cole looked from Grace to Ethan, then toward the 2 boys in the wagon. His face softened with a conflict he did not voice. This ceremony cannot be treated as a trick, he said. You both understand that. Ethan answered first. Mott do. Grace swallowed. Mott do. The words felt strange, almost too large. Not the vow. Not yet. Only the understanding. They went inside the church because the rain had become too hard to stand in. The sanctuary smelled of damp wool, lamp oil, pine boards, and old hymnals. Water ran from Ethan's coat onto the floor. Grace stood near the front pew with mud on her hem, and her heart beating so hard she feared the Reverend could hear it. The boys slipped in after their father. Samuel, the older one, kept himself between Caleb and the strangers. Caleb hid the wooden horse inside his coat as if someone might take even that from him. Grace crouched slowly, ignoring the strain in her knees and the wet fabric pulling at her waist. Hello, she said. Caleb pressed closer to Samuel. Samuel lifted his chin. Are you going to send us away? The question broke something in the room. Ethan turned his face slightly, but not before Grace saw the wound in him. She answered the boy, Not the adults. No, Mott met the one being sent somewhere today. Samuel studied her with a distrust too old for 8 years. Pa says we re-going home after. If he says it, Mott expect he means it. Folks don't always mean things. Grace nodded. No, they don tea. Caleb peeked at her. Can you cook? Mort can. Can you make biscuits? Yes. Ma made biscuits. The room seemed to hold its breath. Grace felt every eye waiting to see whether she would say the wrong thing. I want to make them like she did, Grace said gently. But Mort can make them warm. Caleb considered this. Then he nodded once, as if warmth was a term he might accept. Ethan looked away. Reverend Cole cleared his throat and opened his Bible. The ceremony was brief. It had to be. Nobody sang. Nobody placed flowers. No mother wept softly in the front pew. No sister adjusted Grace's veil. There was no veil, only rain at the windows and the sound of Mrs. Whitcomb's carriage waiting outside like judgment on wheels. When the Reverend asked for a ring, Ethan hesitated. Grace's stomach sank. Of course there was no ring. Men who married from necessity did not carry gold in their pockets. Then Ethan reached into his coat and drew out a plain band of darkened silver. The room changed. Mrs. Whitcomb, who had entered at the back of the church with Mr. Voss beside her, went utterly still. Ethan held the ring as if it weighed more than metal. Grace understood before anyone said it. His first wife's ring. The Reverend S. voice softened. Mr. Mercer. It was kept for my sons, Ethan said. Mrs. Whitcomb stepped forward. That belonged to my daughter. Ethan turned. It belonged to my wife. She left it in my keeping. You have no right to put it on that woman. The words cracked through the church. That woman. Grace looked at the ring. She did not want a dead woman's place. She did not want to begin her life on the ridge by taking a symbol from a grave. She lowered her hand. No, she said. Ethan looked at her. Grace drew a breath. I want he wear a ring that brings pain to your boys or dishonours their mother. If this is a legal marriage, then let the record show it. A ring can wait. Mrs. Whitcomb's face shifted. Barely, but enough. She had expected greed. She had expected desperation. She had expected Grace to snatch any sign of being chosen. Grace gave her none of it. Ethan closed his fingers around the ring. For a moment, his guarded expression loosened with something like gratitude. It vanished quickly, but Grace saw it. Reverend Cole nodded. Then by consent and witness, without ring, we proceed. The vows came like stepping stones across black water. Grace promised lawful fidelity, household partnership, and honest conduct. She spoke clearly. She did not promise love. Neither did Ethan. But when his turn came, his voice was low and steady, and he promised protection, provision, and respect. Respect. The word unsettled her more than wife. When it was done, Reverend Cole signed the certificate. Ethan signed beneath. His handwriting was plain, heavy, and careful. Grace took the pen last. Her fingers were cold. For one terrible second, she saw herself as the town saw her. Too plain, too unwanted, accepting a bargain because no real affection would ever come. Then she looked at Samuel and Caleb. Samuel watched the pen. Caleb watched her face. Grace signed her name. Grace Hawthorne became Grace Mercer in black ink while rain washed the church windows clean. Mr. Voss stepped forward immediately. For the court, Reverend, Mott will need to verify the certificate. Ethan took the paper before the banker could touch it. Voss smiled. Surely there is no need for suspicion. There's every need. Mrs. Whitcomb's voice chilled. You think this performance will satisfy Judge Harlan? Mott think the law asks whether Mott have a wife and a fit household, Ethan said. Now Mott have one. You have a stranger. Grace turned. So do you... Ma'am. The older woman's eyes sharpened. Mott beg your pardon? You re-asking a judge to take two boys from their father. Yet you don't know whether Caleb still wakes from nightmares, whether Samuel hides food in his coat pocket when he's frightened, or whether their boots fit. That makes you a stranger to their days. Samuel's eyes flicked toward her. Ethan noticed. So did Mrs. Whitcomb. The older woman smiled then, but it was not warm. You speak boldly for a woman married less than 5 minutes. Grace folded her hands. Mort been silent longer than that. The church went still. Mrs. Whitcomb looked at Ethan. This will not stand. Ethan tucked the certificate inside his coat. Then challenge it proper. Oh, Mort intend to. She turned and walked out, Voss following with his folder under his arm. Silas lingered near the doorway, his wet hat twisted in Beote hat hands, hatred bright in his eyes. Grace expected him to leave. Instead, he smiled. It was small, private, mean. You forgot something. Sister, he said. Grace knew before he said it. Your trunk is no longer at the house. Her blood chilled. Ethan stepped toward him. Where is it? Silas lifted one shoulder. Settled against debt. Grace gripped the pew. You sold my things? Not sold. Secured. My Mother S. skillet was in that trunk. Then you should have paid what you owed. Mort owed nothing. Silas' eyes slid toward the certificate hidden in Ethan S. coat. Judge can decide what wives, debts, and thieves are worth. Ethan moved so fast the floorboards creaked beneath him, but Grace caught his sleeve. No, she said. He stopped. Silas wanted violence. One blow from Ethan inside a church would become a story by sundown. Wild mountain man attacks respectable merchant after sham marriage. Mrs. Whitcomb and Voss would use it like a sharpened nail. Grace felt Ethan S. arm tense beneath her hand. Then he stepped back. Trust over anger. A choice. Silas' smile faded when he realized they would not give him what he wanted. Grace lifted her chin. Where is the trunk? At the freight office, he said. Locked for transport. Transport where? He opened the church door and let in the rain. Wouldn't you like to? Then he was gone. For a moment no one moved. Grace could feel the absence of that trunk like a wound. The dresses did not matter. The quilt mattered, but she could survive without it. The skillet hurt, because it was the one thing of her Mother S. that had not been handed to a prettier cousin. But the account book mattered most. Without it, Silas' forged debt could stand. With it, she could prove he had lied. Maybe more than lied. In those pages were copied entries from the Hawthorne store, freight receipts, grain tallies, and notes from the week's mister. Voss had begun visiting her brother after closing. She had not understood their importance before. Now she wondered if Silas had not taken the trunk because of her marriage at all. Perhaps he had taken it because of what was inside. Ethan turned to Reverend Cole. Freight office, open. Until sundown. We'll go. Grace looked toward the boys. Caleb had begun to tremble, either from cold or fear. Samuel pretended not to. No, she said. Ethan frowned. Your trunk? Can wait 1 hour. They need dry clothes and food. My wagon has blankets on tea-dry socks. And boys who listen to adults fight over them need something warm in their hands before they start believing they re the trouble. Ethan stared at her. She feared she had spoken too sharply. Too soon, as a wife with ink still wet on the page. But then his gaze shifted to Caleb shaking hands. He nodded. Mercantile first, he said. Samuel spoke quickly. Pa, we'd on to ner a day. What can ove kep, Ethan said. We re-getting it anyway. Outside, the rain had softened to a cold drizzle. The town watched them leave the church as if watching a wagon roll toward a cliff. Grace walked beside Ethan. Not behind him. She noticed that he adjusted his pace for her without making a show of it. Men often either rushed ahead to prove she was slow or hovered as if she might collapse. Ethan did neither. He simply walked. At the mercantile, Mrs. Pike stood behind the counter with her mouth pinched tight. Ethan placed coins down. 2 pairs boys' socks. Coffee. Flour. Salt. Dried apples if you have them. Mrs. Pike glanced at Grace. Anything for your new bride. The words were sweet as spoiled jam. Grace looked toward the shelves. She saw needles, lamp wicks, lye soap, beans, tobacco, ribbon, tinned peaches too expensive for sensible people, and a stack of account paper tied with string. Pencil, she said, and paper. Mrs. Pike blinked. Paper? Yeah. Ethan set another coin down. Grace added, and a small bottle of ink, if it hasn't tea frozen. Mrs. Pike fetched the items without another word. When they stepped back outside, Ethan handed the parcel to Samuel and the socks to Grace. For the boys, he said. Grace nodded. The words between them remained practical. That was a relief. Practical words were boards across a flood. You could step on them. They reached the freight office as the sky darkened over the ridge. The clerk, Mr. Ansell, was sweeping mud from the doorway and looked displeased to see them. We reclosed near enough, he said. Ethan removed his hat. Silas Hawthorne brought a trunk here. Mr. Ansell leaned on the broom. Can't discuss freight that ain't yours. Grace stepped forward. It is mine. Brown trunk. Iron latch. One handle repaired verkepitat braided cord. The clerk's eyes flickered. So it was there. What Luglunk need the claim ticket, he said. My brother stole it. Then you Luglunk need him. Ethan S. voice lowered. Careful. Grace touched his sleeve again, but this time she did not need to stop violence. She needed him to let her work. Mr. Ansell, she said, was the trunk paid for transport or storage? The clerk hesitated. Storage. How long? 30 days. Under what name? Can T say? Grace studied the office behind him. A scale. A wall map. Freight tags hanging from nails. A register open on the desk with blotting sand still scattered across the latest line. Fresh entry. She could not read it from the doorway, but she could read the clerk. He was nervous. Mr. Ansell, Grace said carefully, if a man stores property under his own name that belongs to another person, and that property contains account records relevant to a disputed debt, the circuit judge may ask why the freight office helped conceal evidence. The clerk's knuckles tightened on the broom. Mort de ne conceal nothing. Then show me the register. Mort can because Silas paid you not to. His face flushed. Now see here. Ethan stepped closer. Answer her. A wagon rattled at the far end of the street. The freight office smelled of wet rope, dust, and old wood. Somewhere inside, water dripped into a bucket. Mr. Ansell looked from Ethan's scarred jaw to Grace's steady eyes. Then he said, wasn't Silas. Grace went cold. Ethan's gaze sharpened. Who? The clerk swallowed. Mr. Voss paid storage. Said the trunk was connected to a bank matter. Grace felt the world tilt slightly. Voss. The banker. The man holding papers beside Mrs. Whitcomb. Ethan spoke slowly. Where is it? Mr. Ansell shook his head. Still here. But Mott can T release it. Bank hold. Grace gripped the parcel of socks against her chest. A bank cannot hold a woman's private trunk without lien. Judgment or signed note. Mr. Ansel looked miserable. Mott just keep freight. Then keep it, Ethan said. No one moves it. The clerk did not answer. Grace heard the silence. When is it scheduled to leave, she asked. Mr. Ansel's eyes dropped. Ethan's voice became very quiet. When? The clerk looked toward the darkening road north of town. Midnight, he said. Private wagon. Grace's fingers went numb. Midnight. Not tomorrow. Not after a hearing. Not after anyone could object. The trunk was being stolen out from under the town before she had been married half a day. Ethan turned toward the wagon where his sons waited under a canvas cover, then toward the ridge road disappearing into rain and pine shadow. Every practical need stood against every urgent threat. The boys needed home, Grace needed that trunk. The court date hung 3 weeks away, but someone was already moving evidence in the dark. He looked at her. What S in it? Grace thought of the little oilcloth book, the copied receipts, the freight tallies, the weeks of numbers she had written by lamplight while Silas slept off whiskey in the back room. She thought of Mr. Voss gold watch chain and Mrs. Whitcomb S. silver cane. She thought of the way Silas had smiled. My life, she said. And maybe the reason they don't want me in yours. A gust of cold wind pushed rain beneath the freight awning. Inside the office, the register page lifted and settled. Grace saw one word written near the bottom before the clerk slapped the book shut. Whitcomb. Ethan saw it too. The two of them stood in the wet street. Legally bound, barely acquainted, with 2 frightened boys waiting in a wagon and a stolen trunk marked for midnight. Then the courthouse bell struck once, and from the far end of town, Mrs. Whitcomb's black carriage turned toward the freight office. The black carriage rolled through the rain like a warning. Grace watched it approach the freight office while cold water dripped from the edge of the awning and splashed against the muddy boards beneath her boots. Beside her, Ethan stood motionless. He wasn't the kind of man who fidgeted when danger appeared. He simply became still the way a hunter became still before deciding where to place a shot. Mrs. Adelaide Whitcomb sat upright inside the carriage. Her veil lifted now, her silver hair pinned neatly beneath a dark hat. Wealth had softened neither her face nor her eyes. Those eyes remained sharp and calculating. The carriage stopped. Mr. Voss stepped down first. The banker adjusted his gloves before speaking. Interesting place for newlyweds to spend their wedding afternoon. Ethan didn't answer. Grace noticed something else. Voss wasn't surprised to find them there. That meant he already knew about the trunk. Perhaps he had known exactly where they would come. The realization settled heavily in her stomach. Someone was moving faster than they were. Someone had expected every step. Mrs. Whitcomb remained seated. Mort hoped, she said, that after the ceremony, cooler minds would prevail. Meaning yours? Ethan asked. Her gaze shifted toward Grace. Meaning hers. The older woman studied Grace carefully. Not with disgust. Not exactly. With assessment. Like a lawyer examining a witness before deciding how difficult she might become. You seem intelligent, Mrs. Whitcomb said. Grace almost laughed. 3 hours earlier, most of the town had treated her like unwanted baggage. Now suddenly she seemed intelligent. Interesting how quickly perceptions changed when someone feared what you knew. Thank you, Grace replied. It was a compliment. Mort day not take it as one. A flicker crossed the older woman's face. Voss stepped forward smoothly. Mrs. Mercer. The name felt strange. So strange that Grace almost failed to realize he had used it deliberately. testing it, measuring her reaction. You've entered a complicated situation. Ethan Mercer has debts, property disputes, an ongoing custody challenge. You forgot enemies, Ethan said. Voss smiled. Mott assumed those were obvious. Grace folded her arms. Rain tapped softly against the freight office roof. What do you want? Mr. Voss? The banker seemed pleased by the question. Direct negotiations. That was where men like him lived. We want clarity. His smile thinned. You don't want clarity. If you wanted clarity, you would release my trunk and explain why a banker is paying storage fees on property that does belong to him. The freight clerk nearly dropped his broom. Mrs. Whitcomb's expression hardened. Voss remained composed. That trunk contains documents connected to ongoing financial matters. It contains my belongings. It may contain records relevant to legal proceedings. There it is, Grace said quietly. For the first time, Voss looked annoyed. Just slightly. Enough. Grace continued. You aren't interested in the trunk because of me. Nobody spoke. She looked directly at Mrs. Whitcomb. You aren't interested because of me either. The older woman's silence was answer enough. Grace felt Ethan's attention shift toward her. Watching. Listening. Learning. Good. Let him. Because she was beginning to understand something important. This wasn't merely a custody dispute. And it wasn't merely about a marriage. Somewhere inside her missing account book was information important enough for a banker and one of the wealthiest women in the county to interfere personally. That made her far more dangerous than she had realized. Mrs. Whitcomb finally spoke. You've known Mr. Mercer less than a day. Correct. Then allow me to offer advice. Grace waited. The older woman looked toward Ethan. My daughter married him despite every warning Mott gave. Something changed in Ethan's face. Not anger. Pain. Old pain. Deep pain. Mrs. Whitcomb saw it too, and continued anyway. She died on that mountain. The rain seemed louder suddenly. Even the freight clerk stopped moving. Grace glanced toward Ethan. His jaw had tightened. But he said nothing. Mrs. Whitcomb continued. She deserved comfort. Doctors. Proper care. She had care, Ethan said quietly. The words snapped through the air. She had isolation. Ethan's eyes darkened. No. The older woman leaned forward. For 2 years Mott V watched you hide behind silence while people pretend my daughter simply became ill. Grace felt a chill unrelated to weather. Simply became ill. That was to how people usually described a death. Not if the cause was clear. Ethan took 1 step forward. Stop. The banker placed a calming hand on the carriage door. Perhaps this isn't the place. Mrs. Whitcomb ignored him. My daughter begged to come home. Grace looked sharply at Ethan. The mountain man didn't move. Didn't he speak? Didn't to defend himself. That frightened her more than shouting would have, because innocent men usually denied accusations. Guilty men denied accusations too. But wounded men sometimes stayed silent because truth hurt more than lies. Mrs. Whitcomb stared at him. You refuse. The silence stretched. Then Ethan spoke. Mott brought a doctor. You brought one too late. That's not what he said. The older woman's expression cracked for a second. Grief. Real grief. Not strategy. Not manipulation. Grief. Then it vanished again, hidden beneath years of anger. Grace suddenly understood something. Mrs. Whitcomb might be wrong, but she genuinely believed Ethan had failed her daughter. That belief made her dangerous, because people could justify almost anything when convinced they were protecting the dead. The banker stepped forward. "This discussion serves no purpose." "No," Grace said. "It does too." She looked at Ethan, then at Mrs. Whitcomb. This argument happened before. Nobody answered, because everyone knew she was right. This wasn't new. This wound had existed for years, long before court papers, long before custody hearings, long before Grace arrived. Whatever had happened to Ethan S.'s first wife stood at the centre of everything, and nobody was telling the whole story. Mrs. Whitcomb drew a slow breath. "You repercept. Mort keep ledgers. What does that mean?" "It means people reveal themselves through inconsistencies." Voss shifted slightly. Grace noticed. "Interesting. Very interesting. You said you want custody because the boys need stability." Mrs. Whitcomb nodded. "Yes." "You said Ethan is unfit." "Yes." "You said this marriage changes nothing." "Correct." Grace tilted her head. "Then why are you afraid of it?" The older woman froze. Only for a second. But Grace saw it. So did Ethan. And Voss. That single second told them more than any speech. Because Mrs. Whitcomb was afraid. Not of Grace. Not even of Ethan. Afraid of something this marriage might expose. The banker stepped in immediately. "We've wasted enough time." He turned toward Ethan. "Judge Harlan arrives in 20 days. 20. Ethan S.'s eyes narrowed. The correction mattered. Because Voss should know that. Unless he had spoken Vecepite at someone inside the court circuit. Someone before official notices were delivered. Grace saw Ethan realize it too. The banker smiled. Tiny mistake. Tiny crack. But it existed now. Then Voss reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "This arrived from Denver this morning." He handed it toward Ethan. Reluctantly, Ethan accepted it. The envelope bore no return address. Only his name. The handwriting looked unfamiliar. Grace watched him open it. Watched him read. And watched all colour disappear from his face. Her pulse quickened. Ethan rarely showed emotion, which meant whatever he had just read was serious. Very serious. "What is it?" she asked. For several seconds, he didn't answer. Then he folded the paper. Slowly. Carefully. As if touching something dangerous. "We relieve." Voss smiled. Mrs. Whitcomb looked satisfied. That frightened Grace most of all. Ethan turned toward the wagon. Toward Samuel and Caleb. Toward the road leading north into the mountains. Grace caught his arm. "Ethan." He stopped. She lowered her voice. What was in the... His gaze met hers. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw genuine fear. Not fear for himself. Fear for his children. The realization hit her immediately. Whatever was written in that letter threatened the boys. He handed her the folded paper. She opened it. Read 6 lines. And felt ice spread through her chest. The letter was unsigned. But its meaning was unmistakable. If Ethan Mercer wished to keep custody of Samuel and Caleb, he should stop asking questions about old bank records, abandoned land surveys, and the Whitcomb estate. Otherwise, evidence would soon surface proving his marriage fraudulent. and if the court declared the marriage invalid, the boys would be removed immediately. Grace read the final sentence twice, then a third time, because she wanted to be sure. The words remained unchanged. You should also kep that your new wife has already been investigated. Grace's breath caught. Someone had investigated her. Before today. Before the wedding. Before Ethan had chosen her. Which meant this wasn't a reaction. It was preparation. Someone had expected her to become involved. Someone had been watching. She turned the page over. Nothing. No signature. No clue. Just one small mark pressed into the paper near the bottom corner. A faint impression left by another sheet written above it. Most people would miss it. Grace didn't. Years of bookkeeping had taught her to notice impressions. Pressure marks. Indentations. Ghostwriting. She tilted the page toward the fading light and saw 3 barely visible letters. Num. R. C. Her heart skipped. Not because she understood them. Because she knew they meant something. Something important enough to hide. Something important enough to threaten children over. Ethan looked at her. What is... Grace folded the paper. Slowly. Carefully. The same way he had. Then she looked toward the mountains rising dark against the storm clouds. Toward the cabin she had never seen. Toward the life she had entered only hours earlier. And toward a mystery that was already far larger than either of them understood. Not think, she said quietly. Someone was afraid we'd start asking the right questions. Then she climbed into the wagon. And for the first time since their marriage began, Ethan Mercer looked at her not as a practical solution, but as an ally. Behind them, the black carriage remained motionless in the rain, watching, waiting, and somewhere inside the freight office sat a stolen trunk scheduled to disappear at midnight. Along with secrets, someone seemed willing to destroy a family to keep buried. The wagon climbed north through rain and gathering darkness. Grace sat beside the 2 boys beneath the canvas cover while Ethan guided the team along the muddy mountain road. The wheels groaned over stones hidden beneath water. Wind moved through the pines in long mournful waves. Caleb had fallen asleep with his wooden horse tucked beneath his chin. Samuel had not. The older boy watched everything. Every shadow. Every bend in the road. Every movement his father made. Children learned caution from the adults around them. Samuel had learned too much. Grace wrapped the spare blanket more tightly around Caleb's shoulders. You can sleep too, she told Samuel. You've been awake since dawn. Mott said no. The sharpness would have offended many adults. Grace wasn't offended. Fear often wore the mask of stubbornness. Mort used to stay awake during storms, she said. Samuel glanced at her. Because I thought if Mott slept, bad things would happen while Mort wasn't looking. His expression changed slightly. Not agreement. Recognition. You still think that? Why? Grace considered. Because eventually she'd learned that staying awake didn't stop bad things. It only made you tired when they arrived. But that answer felt too heavy for an 8-year-old. Because Mott got old, Samuel thought about this. Then nodded once. Acceptable answer. The wagon rolled onward. For nearly an hour nobody spoke. Grace found herself watching Ethan. Not openly. Just enough to learn. The mountain man drove the team with quiet efficiency. No wasted motion. No unnecessary commands. The horses trusted him. Even in darkness they responded to small shifts of the reins and brief spoken instructions. A practical man. A man accustomed to responsibility. A man carrying something heavy. The letter from town sat inside his coat. She could almost feel its presence, like a knife hidden beneath cloth. Eventually Ethan spoke without turning. Samuel. Yes. Pa. When we get home, show Mrs. Mercer where everything is. The boy hesitated. Everything. Everything. Grace noticed the significance immediately. Trust. Not complete trust, but the beginning of it. A stranger couldn't care for children without understanding a household. Ethan was giving her access. Samuel understood too. His eyes widened slightly. Then he nodded. Oh, the rain finally began to ease. Clouds drifted apart enough for moonlight to appear in broken patches across the mountains. And then Grace saw it. The cabin. At first it appeared only as a faint glow among the trees. Then gradually details emerged. A 2-story log structure built against a rocky hillside. A large barn. A smokehouse. Several fenced pastures. Wood stacks protected beneath lean-tos. A hand pump. A root cellar built into the slope. Not wealth. Not luxury. But substantial. Far more substantial than she'd expected. Ethan noticed her surprise. Disappointment. You expected small. Yes. A hint of amusement touched his voice. Most people. The wagon rolled into the yard. Dogs barked. 3 of them. Large animals. Protective but controlled. They ran toward the wagon, tails wagging once they recognized Ethan. Caleb woke immediately. He scrambled down before anyone could stop him and threw his arms around the biggest dog. The animal nearly knocked him over with enthusiasm. For the first time all day, Grace heard genuine laughter. Not polite laughter. Not cruel laughter. Child laughter. The sound warmed something inside her. Samuel climbed down next. More carefully. Less openly joyful. But he immediately checked the barn doors, glanced toward the livestock pens, and looked over the property as if confirming everything remained where it belonged. 8 years old, already carrying responsibilities that should belong to adults. Grace filed the observation away. Ethan unharnessed the horses. Motleglunk finished chores. You've been driving all day, Grace said. He shrugged. Animals don't care. No. But people should. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Ethan paused. Looked at her. Then continued unharnessing. But she noticed something. He moved slightly slower afterward, as if considering the statement. Interesting. Very interesting. The cabin interior surprised her even more. It wasn't tea dirty. It was tea neglected. It wasn't tea unlivable. It was exhausted. There was a difference. Everything showed signs of a household operating with too few hands. Dishes stacked neatly but not put away. Laundry folded but unfinished. Mending basket overflowing. Floor swept but needing another pass. Books piled beside a chair. School papers on a table. Children's boots drying near the stove. Not neglect. Overwork. One man trying to perform the labor of several people. Grace understood immediately. The cabin felt like someone holding their breath for 2 years. Samuel began the tour exactly as his father instructed. That the pantry. He pointed. Root cellar outside. Another point. Water bucket goes. Point. Extra blankets upstairs. Point. Grace followed patiently. The boy's seriousness was almost comical. Almost. Then she realized something. He was giving a tour. He was evaluating her, testing whether she would listen, whether she would care, whether she would stay. The realization broke her heart a little, because children should not need to conduct interviews for adults entering their lives. When the tour ended, Samuel folded his arms. "Can you cook?" Grace smiled slightly. "Your brother already asked me that. Can you?" "Yes." "What?" "Several hundred things." That caught him off guard. "What kind of thing?" Grace opened the pantry, studied its contents. Flour, beans, salt pork, potatoes, dried apples, cornmeal, molasses. Not a bad supply. Actually quite organized. Ethan clearly understood preparation. "Tonight," she said, "potato soup, biscuits, fried apples." Caleb's eyes widened. "Really? Really?" The younger boy immediately looked convinced. Samuel remained cautious, but hopeful. The difference mattered. After they settled near the stove, Grace quietly began exploring the kitchen. Not snooping, learning. Every household had patterns. Understanding them prevented conflict. The stove worked well. The chimney drafted properly. The cookware was maintained. The shelves were sturdy. The knives sharp. Someone cared about this place. Deeply. That realization settled another question. Ethan hadn't married because he wanted a housekeeper. A man wanting a housekeeper would have maintained things this carefully himself. No, he truly needed help with the children, which somehow made the arrangement easier to accept. As she prepared supper, she noticed something else. A ledger, partially hidden beneath several folded newspapers. Her pulse quickened. Not because it was unusual, because it immediately caught her eye. The cover bore the stamp of First Territorial Bank. Mr. Voss S. Bank. Interesting. Very interesting. Grace waited until Samuel and Caleb became distracted with the dogs. Then she opened it. Only briefly, only enough to examine the first few pages, and immediately found something wrong. Very wrong. The payment entries didn't match. She read them twice. 3 times. Certain now. The dates were inconsistent. A mortgage payment appeared in March, then appeared again in April. Same amount. Same notation. Same handwriting. Duplicate entries. Either Ethan had somehow paid twice, or someone wanted it to appear that he owed twice. Her heartbeat accelerated. She flipped another page. Another inconsistency. Then another. Then another. Not obvious. Not enough for most people to notice, but obvious to someone who had balanced accounts for years. Someone had manipulated this ledger. Not heavily. Not carelessly. Precisely. Strategically. Enough to create debt that shouldn't exist. A floorboard creaked. Grace looked up. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching her. For several seconds neither spoke. Then he looked at the ledger. You found it. Not anger. Not surprise. Resignation. Grace slowly closed the book. How long have you suspected? His expression darkened. A year. A year. Grace stared. You've known for a year. Mott V known something was to right. Why didn't you challenge it? Mott. A humorless smile appeared. Voss owns the bank. There it was. The answer. Simple. Ugly. Practical. A man could challenge numbers, but challenging the man controlling those numbers was different. Grace looked at the ledger again, then at Ethan, then back at the ledger. A dangerous idea formed. Slowly, carefully, the way storms formed beyond mountain ridges. You kept every receipt. He nodded. Every locked box upstairs. Grace felt excitement spark through her. For the first time since leaving town. For the first time since discovering the trunk had been stolen. For the first time since hearing the threat in the anonymous letter. Hope. Real hope. Because ledgers lied. But receipts remembered. And somewhere inside this house might be enough proof to expose whatever game Voss was playing. Ethan watched her. Grace looked up. Mort think your banker made a mistake. That got his attention. What mistake? She tapped the ledger. He assumed nobody would know how to read it. Silence. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan smiled. Only slightly. Only for a second. But it transformed him. The severity remained. The scars remained. The grief remained. Yet suddenly Grace could see the man beneath them. And she understood why someone might once have loved him. The moment vanished quickly. A knock echoed through the cabin. Hard. Sharp. Unexpected. Everyone froze. The dogs began growling immediately. Deep, dangerous growls. Not greeting sounds. Warning sounds. Ethan crossed the room in 3 strides and reached for the rifle hanging near the door. Another knock. Louder. Then a voice. Male. Urgent. Ethan. The mountain man's expression hardened. Grace had never seen this visitor before, but Ethan clearly had. And whatever recognition appeared on his face wasn't good. Not good at all. Because the first thing he said, "What happened?" And the man outside answered, "They found Jacob Turner dead." The wagon climbed north through rain and gathering darkness. Grace sat beside the 2 boys beneath the canvas cover while Ethan guided the team along the muddy mountain road. The wheels groaned over stones hidden beneath water. Wind moved through the pines in long mournful waves. Caleb had fallen asleep with his wooden horse tucked beneath his chin. Samuel had not. The older boy watched everything. Every shadow. Every bend in the road. Every movement his father made. Children learned caution from the adults around them. Samuel had learned too much. Grace wrapped the spare blanket more tightly around Caleb's shoulders. "You can sleep too," she told Samuel. "No, you've been awake since dawn." Mott said no. The sharpness would have offended many adults. Grace wasn't offended. Fear often wore the mask of stubbornness. Mort used to stay awake during storms, she said. Samuel glanced at her. "Why?" "Because I thought if Mott slept, bad things would happen while Mott wasn't looking." His expression changed slightly. Not agreement. Recognition. "You still think that?" "No." "Why not?" Grace considered. Because eventually she'd learned that staying awake didn't stop bad things. It only made you tired when they arrived. But that answer felt too heavy for an 8-year-old. Because Mott got older. Samuel thought about this. Then nodded once. Acceptable answer. The wagon rolled onward. For nearly an hour nobody spoke. Grace found herself watching Ethan. Not openly. Just enough to learn. The mountain man drove the team with quiet efficiency. No wasted motion. No unnecessary commands. The horses trusted him. Even in darkness they responded to small shifts of the reins and brief spoken instructions. A practical man. A man accustomed to responsibility. A man carrying something heavy. The letter from town sat inside his coat. She could almost feel its presence, like a knife hidden beneath cloth. Eventually Ethan spoke without turning. Samuel. Yes. Pa. When we get home, show Mrs. Mercer where everything is. The boy hesitated. Everything. Everything. Grace noticed the significance immediately. Trust. Not complete trust, but the beginning of it. A stranger couldn't care for children without understanding a household. Ethan was giving her access. Samuel understood too. His eyes widened slightly. Then he nodded. The rain finally began to ease. Clouds drifted apart enough for moonlight to appear in broken patches across the mountains. And then Grace saw it. The cabin. At first it appeared only as a faint glow among the trees. Then gradually details emerged. A 2-story log structure built against a rocky hillside. A large barn. A smokehouse. Several fenced pastures. Wood stack stood beneath lean-tos. A hand pump. A root cellar built into the slope. Not wealth. Not luxury. But substantial. Far more substantial than she'd expected. Ethan noticed her surprise. Disappointed? You expected smaller. Yes. A hint of amusement touched his voice. Most people. The wagon rolled into the yard. Dogs barked. 3 of them. Large animals. Protective but controlled. They ran toward the wagon, tails wagging once they recognized Ethan. Caleb woke immediately. He scrambled down before anyone could stop him and threw his arms around the biggest dog. The animal nearly knocked him over with enthusiasm. For the first time all day, Grace heard genuine laughter. Not polite laughter. Not cruel laughter. Child laughter. The sound warmed something inside her. Samuel climbed down next. More carefully. Less openly joyful. But he immediately checked the barn doors, glanced toward the livestock pens, and looked over the property as if confirming everything remained where it belonged. 8 years old. Already carrying responsibilities that should belong to adults. Grace filed the observation away. Ethan unharnessed the horses. Mort Le Glunk finished chores. You've been driving all day, Grace said. He shrugged. Animals don't care. No. But people should. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Ethan paused. Looked at her. Then continued unharnessing. But she noticed something. He moved slightly slower afterward, as if considering the statement. Interesting. Very interesting. The cabin interior surprised her even more. It wasn't tea dirty. It wasn't tea neglected. It was tea unlivable. It was exhausted. There was a difference. Everything showed signs of a household operating with too few hands. Dishes stacked neatly but not put away. Laundry folded but unfinished. Mending basket overflowing. Floor swept but needing another pass. Books piled beside a chair. School papers on a table. Children's boots drying near the stove. Not neglect. Overwork. One man trying to perform the labor of several people. Grace understood immediately. The cabin felt like someone holding their breath for 2 years. Samuel began the tour exactly as his father instructed. That's the pantry. He pointed. Root cellar outside. Another point. Water bucket goes there. Point. Extra blankets upstairs. Point. Grace followed patiently. The boy's seriousness was almost comical. Almost. Then she realized something. He was giving a tour. He was evaluating her. testing whether she would listen, whether she would care, whether she would stay. The realization broke her heart a little, because children should not need to conduct interviews for adults entering their lives. When the tour ended, Samuel folded his arms. "Can you?" Grace smiled slightly. "Your brother already asked me that." "Yes." "What?" "Several hundred things." That caught him off guard. "What kind of thing?" Grace opened the pantry, studied its contents. Flour, beans, salt pork, potatoes, dried apples, cornmeal, molasses. Not a bad supply. Actually quite organized. Ethan clearly understood preparation. "Tonight?" she said. "Potato soup, biscuits, fried apples." Caleb's eyes widened. "Really?" The younger boy immediately looked convinced. Samuel remained cautious, but hopeful. The difference mattered. After they settled near the stove, Grace quietly began exploring the kitchen. Not snooping. Learning. Every household had patterns. Understanding them prevented conflict. The stove worked well. The chimney drafted properly. The cookware was maintained. The shelves were sturdy. The knives sharp. Someone cared about this place. Deeply. That realization settled another question. Ethan hadn't married because he wanted a housekeeper. A man wanting a housekeeper wouldn't have maintained things this carefully himself. No. He truly needed help with the children, which somehow made the arrangement easier to accept. As she prepared supper, she noticed something else. A ledger, partially hidden beneath several folded newspapers. Her pulse quickened, not because it was unusual, because it immediately caught her eye. The cover bore the stamp of First Territorial Bank. Mr. Voss S. Bank. Interesting. Very interesting. Grace waited until Samuel and Caleb became distracted with the dogs. Then she opened it. Only briefly. Only enough to examine the first few pages. And immediately found something wrong. Very wrong. The payment entries didn't match. She read them twice. 3 times. Certain now. The dates were inconsistent. A mortgage payment appeared in March. Then appeared again in April. Same amount. Same notation. Same handwriting. Duplicate entries. Either Ethan had somehow paid twice, or someone wanted it to appear that he owed twice. Her heartbeat accelerated. She flipped another page. Another inconsistency. Then another. Then another. Not obvious. Not enough for most people to notice. But obvious to someone who had balanced accounts for years. Someone had manipulated this ledger. Not heavily. Not carelessly. Precisely. Strategically. Enough to create debt that shouldn't exist. A floorboard creaked. Grace looked up. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching her. For several seconds neither spoke. Then he looked at the ledger. Not anger. Not surprise. Resignation. Grace slowly closed the book. How long have you suspected? His expression darkened. 1 year. 1 year. Grace stared. You've known for 1 year, not known something wasn't right. Why didn't you challenge? Mott. And a humorless smile appeared. Voss owns the bank. There it was. The answer. Simple. Ugly. Practical. A man could challenge numbers. But challenging the man controlling those numbers was different. Grace looked at the ledger again, then at Ethan, then back at the ledger. A dangerous idea formed. Slowly, carefully, the way storms formed beyond mountain ridges. You kept every receipt. He nodded. Every... Where? Locked box upstairs. Grace felt excitement spark through her. For the first time since leaving town. For the first time since discovering the trunk had been stolen. For the first time since hearing the threat in the anonymous letter. Hope. Real hope. Because ledgers lied. But receipts remembered. And somewhere inside this house might be enough proof to expose whatever game Voss was playing. Ethan watched her. What? Grace looked up. Mort think your banker made a mistake. That got his attention. What mistake? She tapped the ledger. He assumed nobody would know how to read it. Silence. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan smiled. Only slightly. Only for a second. But it transformed him. The severity remained. The scars remained. The grief remained. Yet suddenly Grace could see the man beneath them. And she understood why someone might once have loved him. The moment vanished quickly. A knock echoed through the cabin. Hard. Sharp. Unexpected. Everyone froze. The dogs began growling immediately. Deep, dangerous growls. Not greeting sounds. Warning sounds. Ethan crossed the room in 3 strides and reached for the rifle hanging near the door. Another knock. Louder. Then a voice. Male. Urgent. Ethan. The mountain man's expression hardened. Grace had never seen this visitor before, but Ethan clearly had. And whatever recognition appeared on his face wasn't good. Not good at all. Because the first thing he said was, "What?" And the man outside answered, "They found Jacob Turner dead." Grace slept less than 2 hours that night. Not because the cabin was unfamiliar. Not because the wind rattled the shutters. Not even because a dead surveyor, a forged debt ledger, and a stolen trunk had somehow become part of her life within a single day. She stayed awake because of the notebook. Jacob Turner's notebook sat on the kitchen table beneath a lantern, and every time she closed her eyes she saw those repeated coordinates. The same numbers. Again, and again, and again. Patterns meant intention, and intention meant purpose. By dawn, the stove had burned low and pale sunlight had begun filtering through the frost gathering along the windows. Grace wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and quietly descended the stairs. The cabin was silent, except for one sound. A pencil moving across paper. She stopped. Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table. The lantern still burned beside him. Several receipts, invoices, and bank records lay spread across the wood. He looked as though he had never gone to bed. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His coffee had gone cold. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Grace crossed the room. You didn't. Neither did you. Fair enough. She sat opposite him. The receipts immediately caught her attention. Mortgage payments, property taxes, supply purchases, loan notices. Exactly the documents she needed. Ethan pushed a stack toward her. Mott found everything. Grace blinked. What? The receipt. For the first time since arriving, something almost resembling humour touched his expression. You said receipts, remember? A strange warmth settled in her chest. Because he had listened. Not merely heard. Listened. That mattered. More than most people realized. Grace carefully organized the documents into groups: payment records, bank correspondence, land taxes, feed purchases, equipment expenses. She worked automatically. Years of bookkeeping had trained her mind to sort chaos into order. Within 30 minutes she found the first discrepancy. Then another. Then 6 more. By the time sunlight filled the kitchen, she was certain. Someone had been stealing from Ethan Mercer for years. Not through obvious theft. Through accounting manipulation. Small amounts. Strategic amounts. Enough to remain unnoticed by most people. Enough to slowly create debt where none should exist. Enough to push a man toward foreclosure. Grace sat back. He looked up immediately. "How much do you think you owe the bank?" His answer came without hesitation. $2,100. Grace exhaled slowly. Silence. She organized the receipts into 2 stacks. One genuine debt. One fabricated. Then pushed them toward him. "You owe approximately $900. The room became very still. Ethan stared. Not speaking. Not moving. Just staring. Grace understood why. The difference wasn't small. It was enormous. Life-changing. She nodded. His gaze returned to the papers. Again. And again, as though hoping the numbers would somehow change. They didn't. Finally he looked at her, and for the first time since she met him, Grace saw something rare. Hope. Careful hope. Dangerous hope. The kind people were afraid to trust, because losing it hurt too much. A pounding on the front door shattered the moment. 3 rapid knocks. Urgent. Everyone froze. The boys appeared at the top of the stairs immediately, clearly accustomed to trouble arriving unexpectedly. Ethan stood, opened the door. Luke Brennan entered carrying a newspaper. His expression was grim. Very grim. Bad news. Ethan accepted the paper. Read. Then cursed softly. Grace's stomach tightened. What happened? Luke looked at her. The sheriff ruled Jacob Turner's death an accident. The room erupted. Impossible, Mary said. She had arrived earlier that morning and now stood beside the stove. A bullet isn't an accident. Luke nodded. We know. Grace felt cold anger spreading through her. Not because the ruling was wrong. Because it was fast. Far too fast. Jacob had been dead less than 24 hours. No proper investigation. No witness interviews. No examination. Just an immediate conclusion. Accident. Convenient. Suspiciously convenient. Ethan folded the newspaper. Sheriff McCall signed. Luke nodded. Yesterday evening. Grace frowned. Yes. Luke nodded again. He signed before sunset. Silence. Then Grace realized something. Jacob's body was discovered until after sunset. The room slowly fell quiet. Everyone reached the same conclusion at roughly the same moment. The sheriff had signed the report before the body was found. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Because that was impossible. Unless someone had prepared the conclusion in advance. Mary swore under her breath. Luke looked sick. Ethan's jaw tightened. Grace stared at the newspaper. Then at the notebook. Then at the survey map. The circle was becoming smaller. Tighter. More dangerous. Because now a sheriff appeared inside it. And once law enforcement became compromised, ordinary protection disappeared. Samuel quietly descended the stairs. Pa? Ethan turned immediately. The hardness vanished from his face. Not completely. Just enough. What is it? The boy hesitated, then held out an envelope. This was on the porch. Everyone froze. Again, the envelope hadn't been there earlier, which meant someone had approached the cabin during the night. Someone close enough to reach the front door, close enough to observe the house, close enough to know exactly where Ethan lived. Luke immediately moved toward the window, scanning outside. Mary reached for the rifle. Grace accepted the envelope. No address. No name. Nothing. Just plain paper. Her stomach tightened. Slowly she opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet. One sentence. Nothing more. She read it, then felt her blood run cold. Ethan saw her expression. Grace handed him the page. His eyes moved across the words, then narrowed. Luke took it next. Mary after him. Nobody spoke, because the message required no explanation. Stop looking for the trunk. Next time W take a shield. Caleb began crying before anyone realized he read part of it over Luke's shoulder. The room erupted instantly. Mary grabbed the page. Luke cursed. Samuel wrapped both arms around his younger brother. Ethan crossed the room in 2 strides. Not toward the threat. Toward his sons. The boys. Always the boys. Grace watched him kneel beside them. Watched him place one hand on Caleb's shoulder. Watched him steady Samuel with nothing more than a glance. And suddenly she understood something important. The threats weren't primarily about evidence. They weren't even primarily about money. Whoever stood behind this understood Ethan Mercer. Understood exactly where to strike. The children. That was the pressure point. The weakness. The leverage, which meant whoever sent the letter knew the family personally. Very personally. Grace slowly took the page back. Studied the handwriting. Simple block letters. Disguised, but not perfectly. The writer had attempted to hide identity. Yet habits remained. Tiny habits. Letter spacing. Pressure marks. Stroke angles. Years of bookkeeping had taught her something valuable. Every person wrote differently, like fingerprints. And suddenly she noticed something. The capital T. Distinctive. Unusual. Identical. Her pulse quickened. She reached for Jacob Turner's notebook. Flipped pages. Searched. Then found it. The same T. Exactly the same. Mary noticed immediately. What? Grace pointed. The handwriting. Luke leaned closer. So? It matches. Everyone stared. Grace turned another page. Then another. Showing them. The person who wrote the threat. Silence. Had access to Jacob Turner's record. The realization struck like lightning. Because that changed everything. The killer wasn't merely connected to the investigation. The killer had physically handled Jacob S. documents after his death, meaning the circle grew smaller still. Smaller. Tighter. Closer. Mary looked toward the door. Toward the forest. Toward the mountain roads. They know where Luke nodded grimly. They always... Ethan stood. Slowly. Dangerously. Grace had never seen him angry before. not truly angry. Now she did. The room seemed smaller around him, quieter, more focused. Not explosive rage, controlled rage. The kind that made other people step backward. "We re-getting that trunk?" Luke blinked. "Today?" Mary nodded immediately. "Mott met come. So Everyone looked at Grace. She met Ethan's gaze. "You need what's inside." He held her eyes for several seconds, then nodded once. Agreement. Partnership. Trust. The beginnings of all three. Outside, clouds gathered above the mountains. A storm was coming. A serious one. The kind that closed roads and trapped travellers. If they wanted the trunk, they had only a few hours. If they waited, it might disappear forever. And somewhere between the cabin and town, someone already knew they had discovered the handwriting connection. Someone already knew the threats had failed. Someone already knew Ethan Mercer was backing down, which meant the next move would be stronger, faster, more dangerous, because desperate people made desperate choices. And Grace had the growing suspicion that she was no longer hunting missing evidence. She was hunting the secret that had gotten Jacob Turner killed. And if she was right, the people responsible would not allow a second witness to survive long enough to expose it. The storm reached the mountains before noon. Dark clouds rolled across the ridges like advancing armies, swallowing patches of sunlight one by one. By the time Ethan saddled the horses, the air carried the sharp metallic smell that always came before heavy weather. Grace stood on the cabin porch, tightening the buttons of her coat. Below her, the valley disappeared beneath drifting mist. The world felt smaller, more dangerous. Exactly the way secrets preferred it. Samuel emerged carrying a bundle of firewood. Mott can watch Caleb. Grace crouched beside him. "You don't have..." The boy shrugged. Mott always... Those 3 words carried far more weight than any child should have been forced to carry. Grace brushed a loose strand of hair from his forehead. "Today you don tea." Samuel frowned. What if something happened? Grace looked toward the barn where Ethan and Luke prepared the horses. Then back at the boy. "Then your father comes home." Samuel wanted to believe that. She could see it. But belief and certainty were different things. Children who lost mothers learned that lesson too early. Eventually he nodded. Not because he was convinced. Because he trusted Ethan. And perhaps, just a little, he was beginning to trust her. That mattered. More than he knew. Within half an hour, Ethan, Grace, Mary, and Luke were riding south toward Calder Creek. The journey felt different this time. Not because the road had changed. Because the stakes had. The stolen trunk was no longer merely Grace's property. It was evidence. Potentially crucial evidence. Evidence someone had already threatened children to obtain. Grace rode beside Ethan. The mountain trail forced them close enough to speak without raising their voices. For several miles neither did. Finally Ethan broke the silence. "Why bookkeeping?" Grace glanced at him. "What? You could have done anything." She almost laughed. "You read accounts better than most bankers." That doesn't mean Mott had choices. The words hung between them. Because both understood. Choice was a luxury many people never received. Especially women. Especially poor women. Especially women whose families considered them burdens. After a while she spoke again. "My father..." Ethan listened quietly. He couldn't keep numbers straight after he injured his hand. Mott started helping. Then Mott started correcting mistakes. A faint smile touched her lips. He hated that. Mort imagine. He called me you. Grace looked at him sharply. Ethan didn't appear apologetic. Interesting. Very interesting. What about you? She asked. What about... Why mountains? For a moment she thought he might refuse. Instead he surprised her. My father trapped him. All his life. Most. And you... He nodded. Grace waited. Eventually he continued. It made sense. The answer sounded simple. Too simple. Because people rarely built entire lives around what merely made sense. There was more. She could feel it. But she didn't push. Everyone carried wounds. Some opened slowly. Others required patience. The conversation died as they descended toward town. The storm thickened. Rain began falling again. Cold. Steady. Relentless. By the time Calder Creek appeared below them, muddy water already rushed through the drainage ditches lining the streets. Something immediately felt wrong. Very wrong. Luke noticed it first. Too many people. He was right. Half the town seemed gathered near the freight office. Wagons. Horses. Men. Women. Crowds. Grace's stomach tightened. What happened? Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. They urged their horses forward. As they approached, voices became audible. Shouting. Arguments. Accusations. Fear. Then Grace saw the smoke. Her pulse stopped. The freight office. Smoke poured from the roof. Dark grey clouds billowed into the rain-filled sky. Fire. The freight office was burning. Ethan spurred his horse forward. The others followed. The crowd parted as they arrived. People ran carrying buckets. Others formed lines toward the creek. Water splashed everywhere. But the fire already owned most of the building. Grace stared. Horrified. Because she knew immediately what this meant. Evidence. Records. Shipping manifests. Storage logs. Her trunk. Everything. Gone. Or nearly gone. Luke swore loudly. Mary looked furious. Ethan dismounted before his horse fully stopped. How long? A man near the bucket line shook his head. Started maybe 20 minutes ago. Nobody knew. Of course they didn't tea. Because this was tea random. Grace felt it in her bones. This was no accident. Not after the threats. Not after Jacob. Not after the trunk. The fire climbed higher. Timbers cracked. Windows shattered. Someone shouted for more water. Someone else screamed about exploding lantern fuel. Chaos. Pure chaos. Grace scanned the crowd. Searching. Watching. Looking for reactions. And then she saw him. Mr. Voss. The banker stood beneath the awning of the mercantile. Dry. Calm. Observing. Not helping. Not panicking. Observing. Like a man watching a planned investment mature. Their eyes met. Only briefly. But long enough. Far too long. Grace felt a chill unrelated to rain. Because Voss wasn't surprised. Not even slightly. She began moving toward him. Fast. Determined. Mary immediately noticed. But Grace didn't stop. The banker remained beneath the awning. waiting, as though he knew she would come. Interesting. Very interesting. By the time she reached him, the fire had consumed half the roof. Smoke darkened the sky. People shouted everywhere. Voss adjusted his gloves. Mrs. Mercer. Grace ignored the greeting. My trunk. The banker smiled faintly. What about it? It was stored. Many things. Grace stepped closer. So convenient. His expression didn't change. What is? The building catches fire the day we come look. Silence. Then amusement. Actual amusement. You think Mott burned a freight office. Mott think you re-standing remarkably calm for a man whose business records might be inside. That landed. Barely. But enough. A tiny crack. Then he smiled again. Fortunately, my important records aren't stored in freight offices. There. Another mistake. Small. But real. Because he knew exactly what records mattered. Grace folded her arms. You knew the fire would happen. You expected it. No. Liar. The word landed hard. Several nearby townspeople turned toward them. Voss's smile vanished. Good. Grace continued. You threatened children. Mott did no such thing. You manipulated accounts. Prove. You interfered vekepte evidence. Prove. His confidence returned. Because this was familiar ground. Legal ground. Evidence ground. And right now she had very little. Voss leaned slightly closer. Careful. Mrs. Mercer. The politeness remained, but cruelty lurked beneath it. Mott understand you re-excited by recent discoveries. Grace said nothing. The banker smiled, but excitement often leads people into mistakes. His eyes drifted toward the burning building. Then back. Particularly people who don't understand the forces involved. The statement struck her immediately. Forces involved. Not debts. Not custody. Not marriage. Something larger. Something hidden. Something he believed beyond her comprehension. Interesting. Very interesting. A tremendous crash interrupted them. Everyone turned. Part of the freight office roof collapsed inward. Sparks erupted skyward. The crowd cried out. And suddenly a voice shouted from near the rear alley. Someone's inside. Panic exploded. Men rushed toward the back. Women screamed. The bucket line dissolved. Grace turned instantly. Inside? Who? Another shout. There's a man in there. Everything happened at once. Ethan sprinted toward the rear entrance. Luke followed. Several townsmen grabbed axes. Smoke thickened. Flames roared. Grace pushed through the crowd. Heart hammering. Fear rising. Because if someone truly remained inside, then this was to merely arson. It was murder. The rear wall had partially collapsed by the time she arrived. People shouted conflicting instructions. Nobody seemed certain what to do. Then she saw Ethan emerge through smoke. Dragging someone. The crowd surged forward. Several men helped pull the unconscious figure clear. Grace immediately knelt beside them. Years of caring for injured workers in her father's store had taught her basic treatment. The man's face was blackened with soot. His clothes smelled of smoke. His breathing was shallow. Very shallow. Grace rolled him carefully onto his side. Water. Someone handed her a canteen. She cleaned soot from his mouth. The man coughed violently, then opened his eyes. For one brief moment confusion filled them. Then terror. Pure terror. He grabbed Grace's sleeve. Hard. Painfully hard. Listen. His voice barely existed. A whisper. A rasp. A dying man's effort. Grace leaned closer. What? The man's eyes darted toward the burning building. Toward the crowd. Toward the banker. Then back. VRC. Her heart stopped. The same initials. Again. What SVRC? The man coughed blood. A bad sign. A very bad sign. Another cough. More blood. Railroad. The words barely escaped. Grace's pulse thundered. Vault. Railroad. Someone behind her gasped. The man clutched her sleeve tighter. There are maps. Where? His eyes struggled to focus. The sentence died. Not because he finished. Because a gunshot echoed across town. The sound cracked through rain and smoke like lightning. The unconscious man jerked. Then went completely still. For one terrible second nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody understood. Then Grace looked down and saw blood spreading across his shirt. Someone had just shot the only witness. In front of half the town. And somewhere within the crowd surrounding the burning freight office. A killer was still standing there for one frozen second. Nobody moved. The gunshot echoed away into the storm. Rain hissed against burning timber. Smoke rolled across the street. And the wounded man collapsed completely against Grace's arms. Dead. The realization struck hard. Not because death was unfamiliar on the frontier. Because this death had happened in front of witnesses. In broad daylight. In the middle of town. Someone had pulled a trigger knowing dozens of people stood nearby. That wasn't desperation. That was confidence. The confidence of a person who believed they would never be held accountable. Damn! Ethan's voice exploded through the chaos. Grace hit the muddy ground instinctively. Several townspeople screamed. Others scattered. Men reached for weapons. Children cried. The entire street erupted into panic. Luke Brennan was already moving. Fast. His rifle appeared in his hands as he sprinted toward the rooftops overlooking the freight yard. East side, someone shouted. No. Church roof. Behind the stables. Nobody knew. Nobody had seen the shooter clearly. That alone told Grace something important. The shot had been planned. Carefully planned. Ethan dropped beside her. You hit? No. His eyes immediately checked her shoulders. Arms. Chest. Looking for blood. Finding none. Only then did he turn toward the dead man. Grace looked too. The bullet had entered high near the collarbone. Precise. Professional. Not luck. Not panic. Execution. Mary arrived seconds later. Her face had gone pale. Who? Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. The man had no obvious identification. No family rushing forward. No friends calling his name. Just a dead stranger carrying information about VRC. VRC? The letters echoed inside Grace's mind. Vault. Railroad. Maps. Under. He had almost told her. Almost. Then someone silenced him. A terrible thought formed. What if he wasn't inside by accident? Ethan looked at her. What? Grace pointed toward the burning freight office. What if he was hiding? Silence. Then understanding. The dead man had survived inside the building. Long enough to be found. Long enough to speak. Long enough to reveal information. Someone had known that possibility existed. Someone had been watching. Waiting. Ready. And the moment he started talking, they killed him. The realization chilled Grace more than the rain, because it meant whoever stood behind this operation wasn't reacting. They were anticipating. Planning. Controlling. Several deputies arrived at last. Sheriff McCall came with them, a heavy-set man with tired eyes and a mustache beginning to grey. The moment Grace saw him, she understood why Voss felt untouchable. The sheriff looked annoyed. Not alarmed. Not outraged. Annoyed, as though murder complicated paperwork. "What happened?" he demanded. Half the crowd began talking at once. McCall silenced them with a raised hand. Then his gaze landed on the dead man, and something strange happened. Something very strange. Recognition. Only for a second. But Grace saw it. The sheriff knew him. Interesting. Very interesting. McCall immediately masked the reaction. Too late. Grace had spent years studying people who lied about numbers. The skill transferred remarkably well to faces. The sheriff turned toward Ethan. "You see the any?" Nobody answered. Because nobody had. The sheriff grunted, then crouched beside the body. His eyes lingered on the dead man's face. Again, recognition. Definitely recognition. Grace filed it away. Another piece. Another inconsistency. Another crack. McCall stood. Looks like he died in the fire. The crowd erupted. What? That's ridiculous. We heard the sheriff's expression darkened. Mort said he died in the fire. Silence followed. Not agreement. Shock. Because now everyone understood. The sheriff wasn't investigating. He was covering. Luke Brennan returned from searching nearby buildings. No. McCall shrugged. Then Luke stared. You serious? The sheriff met his gaze coldly. You got evidence otherwise? No answer. Because evidence had a way of disappearing lately. Jacob Turner. The freight records. Now this. Grace looked toward the mercantile. Toward Voss. The banker was gone. Completely gone. Not even his carriage remained. That frightened her, because it meant he had left before the sheriff arrived, almost as if he knew exactly how events would unfold. Mary noticed, too. Where S. Voss? Nobody knew, or pretended not to. The distinction mattered less each hour. By late afternoon the fire was finally controlled. Not extinguished. Controlled. The freight office stood blackened and broken. Half the roof gone. Most records destroyed. And somewhere inside the wreckage. Grace S. trunk. Perhaps. If it hadn't already been removed. The possibility haunted her. As workers began sorting debris, Ethan approached. We restayed. Grace nodded. She understood immediately. Evidence. Anything surviving the fire might matter. The others agreed. For 3 hours they searched. Rain turned ash into grey sludge. Smoke stung their eyes. Charred beams blocked access to much of the building. Yet they continued, piece by piece, board by board, looking, hoping. Near sunset, Luke shouted. Ethan! Everyone rushed over. Beneath collapsed shelving lay a partially protected storage section. Most contents had burned. One had not. A trunk. Brown. Iron latch. Braided handle. Grace's breath caught. The sight nearly made her dizzy. Not because of the trunk itself. Because it still existed. Barely. But existed. Ethan and Luke pulled it free. The exterior was scorched. The lock broken. Interesting. Very interesting. Grace knelt immediately. Opened it. Inside, smoke damage marked nearly everything. Clothing ruined. Quilt partially burned. Several books destroyed. Her mother's skillet blackened but intact. Then she saw it. The oilcloth bundle. Still there. Her hands trembled. Not from fear. Hope. Careful hope. She unwrapped it. The account book survived. The relief hit so hard she nearly laughed. Around her, everyone exhaled together, because they understood. The book mattered, perhaps more than anything else. Grace opened it immediately, checking pages, entries, records, receipts. Most remained legible. Thank God. Then something unexpected happened. A folded document slid from between the pages. Grace froze. She had never seen it before. The paper wasn't hers. Someone else had hidden it there. Years ago, perhaps. Forgotten. Or deliberately concealed. Grace? Ethan noticed. Slowly she unfolded it. The paper crackled with age. Older than the account book. Much older. A map. Another map. Different from Jacob Turner S. But related. Her pulse quickened. Because several familiar locations appeared. Whitcomb Land. Railroad survey markers. Mountain boundaries. And one phrase written in faded ink across the bottom. Property of Valley Rail Consolidated. Silence. Absolute silence. VRC. The letters stared back from the page. Not initials. A company. A railroad company. A forgotten railroad company. The realization swept through the group. Mary spoke first. Mott Fee never heard of them. Luke nodded. Neither have Mott. Grace studied the map. Then a second detail emerged, one that made her blood run cold. A red X, hidden deep within the northern section of Whitcomb property, near land currently owned by Mrs. Whitcomb herself. Beside the X someone had written 2 words. Silver deposit. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Because suddenly the pieces aligned. The surveyor. The maps. The threats. The forged debts. The railroad. The land. The murders. Silver. Not timber. Not ranching. Not property values. Silver. An enormous silver deposit hidden beneath Whitcomb Land. A discovery valuable enough to create fortunes. Valuable enough to motivate murder. Valuable enough to explain everything. Luke looked stunned. Mary looked furious. Ethan looked thoughtful. Only Grace looked afraid. Because another realization arrived immediately afterward. If this map was genuine, then Mrs. Whitcomb might not be the mastermind. She might be another target. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Because for the first time, Grace considered a possibility nobody had mentioned. What if the people stealing land records weren't protecting Mrs.? Whitcomb? What if they were stealing from her? The idea changed everything, and before Grace could share, a rider appeared at the edge of town, galloping hard, desperate, terrified. The horse nearly collapsed from exhaustion. The rider slid from the saddle, stumbled, then shouted words that froze every person present. They've taken Samuel Mercer. The world stopped. For Ethan, at least, because in that instant, every mystery, every map, every piece of evidence ceased to matter. His son was gone for a moment. Ethan Mercer forgot how to breathe. The rain, the crowd, the fire, the map in Grace's hands. Everything vanished. Only 4 words remained. They've taken Samuel Mercer. The messenger staggered forward, exhausted and soaked from head to toe. His horse stood trembling nearby. Foam covered its neck. The animal had been ridden hard. Very hard. Ethan crossed the muddy street in 3 strides. Who? The man swallowed. Mott Don Tino. Ethan grabbed his coat. Tell me exact. The rider nodded frantically. Mort was cutting fence south of Black Pine Creek. Saw 2 riders. 1 boy. Grace felt ice settle in her stomach. 1 boy. Samuel. Oh God, Mary whispered. The rider continued. The kid was tied to the saddle. Luke cursed violently. Ethan's grip tightened. Alive? Yes. The answer came instantly. Relief flashed across Ethan's face. Only briefly. Then it vanished. Because alive could change very quickly. Which direction? The rider pointed west. Old Mining Road. Grace and Ethan exchanged a glance. Mining Road. Not random. Nothing about this was random anymore. Silver deposits. Railroad maps. Kidnapping. All connected. Every piece connected. The rider continued. Mott followed for maybe half a mile. Why? The man's face paled. Because they saw. Silence. Then he reached into his coat. Slowly. Carefully. And removed a folded paper. They gave me this. Ethan snatched it immediately. Opened it. Read. His face became stone. Grace already knew. The kidnappers wanted something. Always. People who kidnapped children rarely wanted children. They wanted leverage. She took the note. Read. Then wished she had tea. Bring the map. Come alone. Midnight. Miller's Pass. If you bring the law, the boy dies. No signature. No explanation. No negotiation. Just certainty. The certainty of people convinced they controlled the board. Luke swore. Mary looked ready to kill someone. Grace folded the note carefully. They know about them. Nobody argued. Because nobody could. The map had been discovered less than an hour ago. Only a handful of people knew. Yet the kidnappers already demanded it. That meant one thing. Someone had informed them. Immediately. Someone close. Very close. Grace looked around the crowd. Faces. Expressions. Fear. Curiosity. Concern. And somewhere among them, a traitor. The realization made her skin crawl. Ethan reached for his horse. We leave. No. The word escaped Grace before she could stop it. Everyone looked at her, including Ethan. Especially Ethan. She stepped closer. They want you angry. My son is missing. Mott. They threaten. Mott. Then don't tell me to stay calm. The pain in his voice hit harder than shouting would have. Grace took a breath. Carefully. Because this mattered. Listen to me. He didn't answer. Good enough. Grace held up the map. They knew about this immediately. Nobody spoke. Because everyone understood. Someone had reported the discovery. Someone close enough to observe. Someone connected enough to communicate quickly. They expecting you to ride straight into a trap. Luke nodded reluctantly. Ethan's jaw tightened. They already have him. Mary stepped forward. And they still have him if you die. The words landed hard. Because they were true. Terribly true. The silence stretched. Then Caleb's voice broke it. Small. Fragile. Terrified. Everyone turned. The younger boy stood near the wagon, clutching his wooden horse, trying very hard not to cry. Failing. Bring Samuel home. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Just briefly. When they opened again, the rage remained. But something else had returned. Control. The quality that kept men alive. We plan first. Relief swept through Grace. Not because the danger had diminished. Because reckless fathers buried sons. Careful fathers sometimes saved them. The distinction mattered. An hour later they gathered inside the burned remains of the freight office warehouse. The only dry place still standing nearby. A lantern illuminated the map. The original map. The one marked with the silver deposit. Luke studied it. Mary watched the door. Ethan stared at location marked X. Grace examined every detail. Looking. Thinking. Searching. Something bothered her. Something important. The note demanded the map. Specifically the map. Not money. Not evidence. Not the account book. The map. Why? If the kidnappers already knew where the silver existed, why need the map? The answer arrived suddenly. Like lightning. Oh! Everyone looked at her. What? Ethan asked. Grace pointed. Because this isn't complete. Silence. She traced several survey lines. Boundary markers. Elevation notes. Rail references. Then stopped. There should be coordinates. Luke frowned. What? Silver surveys always include extraction references. Mary blinked. You know mining records. My father handled supply accounts for prospectors. Grace continued studying. The map identifies the deposit. Her finger tapped the red X. But not the entrance. The room became very still. Because suddenly everyone understood. The silver existed. Somewhere. But nobody knew precisely where. Not yet. The map revealed the region. Not the location. A missing piece. The crucial piece. Luke leaned closer. So where is... Grace looked at Jacob Turner's notebook. Then at the map. Then at the coordinates repeated throughout. And slowly her heartbeat accelerated. Because she realized something. Something enormous. Something terrifying. Jacob Turner hadn't been searching for silver. He had been searching for the entrance. And he found it. The realization swept through the room. Mary cursed softly. Ethan stared at the notebook. The coordinate. Grace nodded. The repeated number. Luke looked stunned. You re-saying Jacob solved it? Yes. Silence. Then another realization arrived. Worse than the first. Much worse. Grace slowly looked up. If Jacob solved, nobody spoke. Because nobody wanted to. Grace finished anyway. Then someone has his final survey. The room went silent. Dead silent. Because that changed everything. The map was the prize. The notebook wasn't the prize. The real prize was whatever Jacob discovered before he died. And whoever killed him probably already possessed it. Which meant the kidnapping wasn't about finding silver. It was about stopping someone else from finding it first. A terrible thought formed. Grace felt her stomach drop. His eyes met hers. What? She looked toward the note. Toward the demand. Toward Miller S. Pass. They don't actually need them. Luke frowned. What are you saying? Grace swallowed. Slowly. Carefully. They need us. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Because they understood immediately. The map was bait. The kidnapping was bait. The meeting was bait. The kidnappers wanted Ethan Mercer at Miller S. Pass. Wanted him specifically. Wanted him badly enough to take his son. Which meant tonight wasn't an exchange. It was an ambush. The realization hit Ethan hard. Grace saw it. Because suddenly another question emerged. One nobody had asked. Why Ethan? Not Grace. Not Mary. Not Luke. Not Mrs. Whitcomb. Ethan. The mountain man. The widower. The father. The man everyone claimed was drowning in debt. Why was he so important? Then Mary spoke. Quietly. Almost reluctantly. There might be a reason. Everyone turned. The woman looked uncomfortable. More uncomfortable than Grace had ever seen her. What reason? Ethan asked. Mary hesitated. Then sighed. You remember your father? The room changed instantly. Ethan S.'s face hardened. My father is dead. Mott. What about him? Mary looked at the map. Then the notebook. Then the storm gathering outside. And finally back at Ethan. When Jacob visited me 3 days ago. She paused. As though reconsidering. Then continued. He asked whether your father ever told you about the hidden The lantern flickered. Wind rattled the broken warehouse walls. And for the first time all day, Ethan Mercer looked genuinely shocked. Because he knew exactly what those words meant. The hidden claim. And whatever it was. He had never told anyone about it, the hidden claim. The words seemed to suck all warmth from the room. Outside, rain hammered against the damaged warehouse roof. Inside, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because Ethan Mercer's reaction had answered the question before he ever opened his mouth. He knew. Whatever the hidden claim was. He knew. And he had never mentioned it. Not once. Mary folded her arms. Mott thought. Ethan stared at her. For several seconds his face revealed nothing. Then he looked away. That alone was enough. Luke exhaled sharply. You've got to be kidding me. Grace remained silent. Watching. Waiting. Because this wasn't the moment to interrupt. Some truths needed room. Some wounds needed air. Finally Ethan spoke. His voice sounded rough. Where did Jacob hear that name? Mary shook her head. He didn't. The mountain man's jaw tightened. Then why bring it up now? Because your son is missing. The answer landed hard. Hard enough to leave a mark. Mary stepped closer. Whatever this is, Ethan, we repassed the point of keeping secrets. Silence. Rain. Wind. The distant rumble of thunder. Grace watched Ethan carefully. She had known him less than a week. Yet she already understood something important. He was a man who hid things for advantage. He hid things because he carried guilt. There was a difference. A significant difference. Eventually Ethan sat down heavily on a broken crate. The movement looked almost weary. Not physically. Emotionally. Like a man preparing to reopen a grate. My father found something. Nobody interrupted. Good. Because he was finally talking. He was trapping north of Black Ridge nearly 30 years ago. Luke nodded slowly. He knew the area. Everyone local did. Dangerous country. Steep terrain. Few travellers. Ethan continued. He came home carrying survey markers. Grace's attention sharpened immediately. Survey markers. Important. Very important. He said they weren't supposed to be there. Mary frowned. What do you mean? The railroad had abandoned that route years earlier. The room grew quiet. Because everyone understood. Abandoned projects left records. Records mattered. Especially when land was involved. My father followed the markers. Ethan paused. The memory clearly unpleasant. 3 days later he came back with maps. Grace's pulse quickened. Maps. Always maps. Always records. Always evidence. The pattern continued. Luke leaned forward. What kind of maps? Ethan looked toward the storm. Toward memories. Toward something far away. Mining survey. Silence. Then Mary swore softly. Nobody blamed her, because now everything aligned. The railroad. The silver. The surveyor. The hidden claim. The pieces were finally beginning to fit. My father thought he found a mistake. Ethan continued. A forgotten claim. Grace understood immediately. Frontier law was complicated. Very complicated. Mining rights. Land ownership. Railroad grants. Territorial surveys. One clerical mistake could determine ownership of enormous wealth. And enormous wealth motivated terrible people. What happened? She asked quietly. Ethan looked at her. For a moment something vulnerable appeared in his eyes. Then vanished. He hid the map. Luke frowned. Why? Because 2 men died. The room froze. Not again. Not more deaths. Yet somehow nobody felt surprised anymore. Only tired. Grace folded her hands together. How? My father never said. Ethan's expression darkened. He only said the claim was worth blood. Silence followed. Long silence. Because every person present understood the irony. The claim had become worth blood anyway. Lots of blood. Mary finally spoke. Did he keep the map? Ethan nodded. Until he died. Luke immediately asked the obvious question. Where are they now? Another pause. Another hesitation. Grace felt her heartbeat quicken. Because suddenly she knew. Or thought she knew. The answer arrived before Ethan spoke. The mountain man looked at her sharply. Then nodded. Exactly. Gone. Interesting. Very interesting. When? Luke asked. After my wife died. The room changed instantly. Grace noticed. So did Mary. Because now 2 separate tragedies had become connected. The hidden claim. and Ethan S. wife. Neither coincidence. Not any more. Mary looked stunned. You never told me that. Why? Ethan laughed once. A bitter sound. Because nobody would believe me. Grace felt something shift inside her. Not suspicion. Understanding. Whatever happened to Ethan S. wife? Whatever, Mrs. Whitcomb blamed him for. The hidden claim was somehow involved. The realization settled heavily over everyone. Then another voice spoke. Small. Fragile. Terrified. Where is Samuel? Everyone turned. Caleb stood near the warehouse doorway. Rain dripping from his coat. Wooden horse clutched against his chest. No one had heard him arrive. The silence that followed hurt, because nobody had a good answer. Caleb looked at Ethan. Only Ethan. Children always knew where truth lived. Ethan crossed the room immediately, dropped to one knee, took the boy's shoulders gently. We re-bringing him home. When? The question broke hearts. Because children measured time differently. An hour felt endless. A day felt impossible. Ethan swallowed. As soon as we can. Caleb nodded, trying very hard to be brave. Failing. The sight nearly destroyed Grace. Because courage looked different in children. Adults called it resilience. Really, it was survival. The boy stepped closer. Samuel S. scared of caves. The room froze. Grace looked up sharply. What? Caleb wiped his eyes. He hates caves. Ethan stared. Why are you saying? The child frowned, as though the answer should be obvious. Because that S where they take him. Silence. Absolute silence. Mary slowly crouched beside him. What makes you think that? Caleb looked confused, then pointed at the map. The silver plate. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Because suddenly every adult in the room realized something. Children listened, far more than adults assumed. Caleb continued. Samuel said treasure always means caves. Luke blinked. Mary stared. Grace felt her pulse accelerate. Not because the logic was perfect. Because it pointed towards something everyone had missed. Caves. Mines. Tunnels. Entrances. The missing entrance. The thing Jacob Turner had likely discovered. The thing everyone was searching for. A terrible possibility formed. Grace grabbed the notebook, flipped rapidly through pages. Coordinates. Notes. Survey references. Measurements. Then she found it. A symbol. Repeated 3 times. One she'd ignored earlier. A small triangle. Simple. Unremarkable. Except now it was T. Because surveyors often used triangles to mark cave entrances. Her breath caught. Grace? She looked up, excitement and dread mixing together. The entrance. Nobody spoke. She turned the notebook around, pointed. Jacob marked. Luke leaned closer. Mary beside him. Ethan immediately understood. The triangle appeared near one specific coordinate cluster. One location. One destination. One place. Miller S. Pass. The room fell silent again, because suddenly tonight S meeting made sense. Not an ambush site. Not merely a hostage exchange. The entrance. The hidden mine entrance. The location everyone wanted. The kidnappers weren't meeting there by chance. They were meeting there because the silver deposit was there. and Samuel was trapped somewhere near it. Grace slowly looked at Ethan. His face had changed. The grief remained. The fear remained. But now purpose joined them. Direction. Understanding. The pieces finally connected. Then Luke noticed something else. Something nobody had seen before. His expression darkened immediately. Everyone turned. Luke pointed toward the notebook, toward the final coordinate, toward a notation written beside the triangle. Tiny, almost invisible, written in Jacob Turner's hand. Grace leaned closer. Read it once. Then again. Then a third time. Because she wanted to be certain. The words remained unchanged. Relocated. Whitcomb family already knows. The warehouse seemed to tilt. Because those 4 words changed everything. Not Voss. Not railroad men. Not strangers. The Whitcomb family already knew. And if that was true, then either Mrs. Adelaide Whitcomb had been lying from the beginning, or someone inside her family was playing a far more dangerous game than anyone imagined. Outside, thunder shook the mountains. Midnight was coming. Samuel was still missing. And for the first time, Grace realized they might not be riding into a trap tonight. They might be riding into a war that had secretly begun decades ago. The storm broke fully as night fell. Rain lashed the mountains. Wind screamed through the pines. Lightning flashed across distant ridges, illuminating the dark wilderness in brief silver bursts. It was the kind of night sensible people spent beside fireplaces. Not hunting kidnappers. Not chasing murderers. Not riding toward hidden mines. But nobody in the warehouse was thinking about comfort. Samuel Mercer was still missing. That was all that mattered. Grace sat beside a lantern studying Jacob Turner's notebook one final time. The others prepared horses, checked rifles, gathered supplies, spoke little. Everyone understood the stakes. The room felt different now. No longer confused. No longer uncertain. Danger remained. But direction existed. The hidden claim. The silver deposit. The mine entrance. Miller S. Pass. All roads pointed to the same place. Grace carefully copied the crucial coordinates onto fresh paper. If the notebook was lost, destroyed, or stolen, the information would survive. A habit from bookkeeping. Always keep duplicates. Always assume someone will try to erase the truth. Ethan approached quietly. Grace looked up. The lantern light carved hard shadows across his face. Exhaustion showed now. Not weakness. Where? The where of a father whose child was in danger. No, Grace admitted. His mouth twitched slightly. What? People who feel ready for something like this are usually fools. Despite everything, Grace almost smiled. Almost. Outside, horses stamped nervously. Thunder rolled across the mountains. Luke entered carrying a saddlebag. Found some. Everyone looked up. He placed several documents onto the table. Burned around the edges. Smoke damaged. Recovered from the freight office ruins. Grace's pulse quickened. Evidence. Potentially valuable evidence. Very valuable. She immediately began examining them. Shipping manifests. Storage records. Insurance forms. Nothing remarkable. Then she found a name. Valley Rail Consolidated. VRC. The room grew still. Again. Always VRC. Always the same shadow lurking behind everything. Grace carefully unfolded the damaged page. Most of the text had burned away. One section remained legible. Enough. More than enough. Her breath caught. What? Mary stepped closer. Grace pointed. The surviving text referenced property transfers. Old transfers. Very old. 30 years old. Luke frowned. Grace read further, then felt her stomach drop, because suddenly she understood. Really understood. The railroad company never abandoned the route. It only pretended to. Silence. Then Ethan slowly nodded. Understanding arriving. Grace continued. Valley Rail Consolidated discovered the silver. Nobody spoke, because everyone already suspected it. But suspicion and proof were different things. This was proof. The railroad quietly purchased surrounding land. Mary leaned forward. To hide the discovery? Yes. Luke looked grim. Then what happened? Grace studied the surviving text. The answer emerged. Simple. Ugly. Predictable. The company collapsed. Silence. Then understanding. Of course. Railroad failures were common. Fortunes vanished overnight. Ownership became complicated. Records disappeared. Claims became disputed and buried beneath legal confusion. A silver deposit waited. Untouched. Forgotten. Until now. Grace continued reading. Then froze. A specific name appeared. A signature. Not Voss. Not Whitcomb. Not Jacob Turner. Someone else. Someone connected to everything. Someone whose name Grace had never expected. Elias Mercer. The room went completely silent. Ethan stared. His father. The signature belonged to his father. The realization struck everyone simultaneously, because suddenly the hidden claim made perfect sense. Elias Mercer hadn't merely found the silver. He had worked for the railroad, or with it, or against it. But he had been involved. Directly involved. Grace looked up slowly. Ethan, the mountain man's face had gone pale. My father never mentioned Vyas. The statement carried genuine confusion. Interesting. Very interesting. Because liars usually protected secrets. Confused men usually discovered them. Grace believed him. For the first time she realized something important. Ethan truly did know the whole story. Not even close. Which meant someone else did. Someone older. Someone still alive. Mary suddenly stood. Abruptly. Alarmingly. What? Luke frowned. The woman looked shaken. Actually shaken. Grace had never seen that before. Mary stared at the signature. Then at Ethan. Then back. Oh, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Because Mary's reaction frightened them more than the document. What? Ethan asked again. Mary swallowed. Slowly. Painfully. Then spoke. Motka Noovekep, who kept the rest of the records. The warehouse seemed to shrink. Every person focused entirely on her. Who? Mary hesitated. Not from uncertainty. From reluctance. The answer hurt. That much was obvious. Finally, she said it. Your wife. Silence. Absolute silence. Ethan stared. The lantern flickered. Thunder shook the building. And nobody moved. Because those two words changed everything. Your wife. Grace felt her heartbeat accelerate. Not possible. Yet somehow possible. Mary continued quietly. Anna found something before she died. The name sounded strange. Anna. Ethan wife. The woman Mrs. Whitcomb mourned. The woman whose death stood at the centre of every wound. The woman nobody talked about. Until now. Ethan looked as though someone had struck him. Mary's eyes filled with regret. Mott promised not to tell me. The words came out harder than intended. Mary nodded slowly. About 6 months before she got sick. Anna came to me. Grace listened carefully, every instinct screaming that this mattered. Perhaps more than anything yet. She had documents. Mary continued. Survey records. Railroad records. Property transfers. Luke cursed softly. Grace closed her eyes briefly. Of course. Anna had known. Years ago. Perhaps before anyone else. Mary's voice trembled slightly. She said someone was altering county records. The room went still. Voss. It had to be Voss. Or someone before him. Someone inside the system. Someone with access. Someone powerful. She was frightened. Mary looked toward Ethan. Pain visible now. Real pain. More frightened than Mott ever saw. The mountain man didn't move. Didn't he speak? Barely breathed. Grace suddenly understood why. 'Cause every word reopened an old wound. Every word raised terrible questions. Questions Ethan had lived beside for years. Questions he'd never answered. Mary continued. Anna believed someone would kill for the claim. Luke looked sick. Nobody blamed him. Because now Jacob Turner's death was to the beginning. It wasn't even close. The danger had existed for decades. Decades. Then Ethan asked the question everyone feared. Where are the records? Mary closed her eyes. And Mott don't know. The disappointment hit hard. Very hard. But before anyone could speak again, a new voice echoed from the warehouse entrance. Slow. Cold. Confident. Actually, every person spun toward the doorway. A figure stood there, rain dripping from a dark coat, lantern light illuminating familiar features. Grace's blood turned to ice, because she recognized him immediately. Sheriff McCall. The sheriff smiled. Not kindly. Not apologetically. The smile of a man finished pretending. Mocano kept exactly where they are, and behind him, 6 armed men stepped out of the darkness. Don't move. Nobody breathed. The storm howled outside the warehouse while 6 rifles pointed inward. Sheriff McCall stood in the doorway like a man who had finally grown tired of pretending. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his hat. His smile never reached his eyes. Behind him, the armed men spread out carefully. Professional. Disciplined. Not deputies. Not lawmen. Hired muscle. The kind of men who followed money instead of principles. Grace's stomach tightened. Because every lie was finally stepping into the light, Luke Brennan slowly lowered his hand away from his rifle. Not surrender. Calculation. 6 rifles already aimed at them. Fast hands would only get people killed. Especially Ethan. Especially Samuel. McCall stepped inside. You've all become remarkably difficult. Ethan's expression hardened. Where's my son? Straight to the point. Always. The sheriff seemed amused. Still a father before anything else. Answer. McCall shrugged. Alive. The room exhaled collectively. Only slightly. Alive was not safe. Alive was not home. But alive mattered. Ethan took one step forward. Several rifles shifted immediately. The sheriff raised a hand. His voice became colder. You move when Mott say. Silence. Then Grace spoke. You reworking for Voss? McCall looked at her. Interested. Not angry. Interested. The distinction worried her. Smart woman. The S not a denial. The sheriff smiled. Because there's no point denying it now. The words settled over the room like poison. Confirmation. At last. Real confirmation. McCall continued. The banker pays. Luke swore. Mary looked ready to kill him. Grace remained silent. Listening. People often revealed the most when they believed victory was certain. The sheriff walked slowly toward the table. Toward the maps. Toward the notebook. Toward the truth. Do you know how much silver sits beneath those hills? Nobody answered. McCall laughed softly. Enough to buy judge. His eyes shifted toward Ethan. Enough to buy bank. Toward Grace. Enough to buy entire counties. Then toward the storm beyond the doorway. Enough to make decent men forget they re-decent. The statement carried uncomfortable honesty. Because it was true. Terribly true. McCall stopped beside the map. Studied the red X. The hidden claim. The silver deposit. The secret that had poisoned lives for decades. You killed Jacob Turner. Grace's voice remained calm. McCall glanced toward her. No. Interesting. Very interesting. Because he answered immediately. Without hesitation. Without defensiveness. Truth often arrived that way. Grace noticed. So did Ethan. Then who did? The sheriff smiled. Mott din to say, Mott don to know. Silence. Then understanding. McCall wasn't he the mastermind. Only part of the machine. Important distinction. Very important. Grace filed it away. The sheriff reached toward the map. Ethan moved. Not much. Barely. Yet every rifle tightened immediately. The room became dangerous. Instantly. McCall raised a hand. Nobody relaxed. Nobody trusted him enough. Wise. Very wise. The sheriff folded the map carefully. Then looked toward Grace. Mott V wanted to meet you. That surprised her. Genuinely surprised her. Because Voss underestimated you. Interesting. The sheriff's smile widened. He thought you to be... Grace felt a chill. Useful. The word carried implications. None good. McCall continued. The banker expected a frightened woman grateful for a marriage. Luke cursed softly. Mary S. expression darkened. The sheriff shrugged. Instead he got an accountant. Grace said nothing. The compliment was to a compliment. It was a warning. McCall knew exactly how dangerous information could be, and exactly how dangerous she had become. The sheriff looked toward Ethan. Your wife is the reason this became complicated. The word wife landed strangely. Even now. Even after everything. Especially after everything. Ethan's gaze never left the sheriff. Where S... McCall sighed. Almost impatiently. Still that. Only the answer surprised everyone. Even Grace. Because it was honest. Completely honest. Nothing mattered more. Not silver. Not maps. Not revenge. Samuel. Only Samuel. The sheriff studied him for several seconds, then nodded. A strange look crossed his face. Regret. Very brief. Very real. Then gone. Interesting. Very interesting. McCall turned back toward the group. The boys at Miller S. Pass. Luke stiffened. Mary cursed. Ethan S. jaw tightened. The sheriff continued. With Voss. Silence. Then Grace asked the question nobody else considered. Why tell? McCall looked at her. Again. Interested. Always interested. Because you already too late. The warehouse seemed colder. Much colder. Meaning what? Ethan demanded. The sheriff folded his arms. The entrance has been found. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Because that changed everything. Again. The entrance. The mine. The silver. The prize. McCall nodded slowly. As of 2 hours ago, Grace felt her stomach drop. Jacob S. final survey. The coordinates. The cave entrance. Voss had it. Already. The realization struck like a hammer. All this time. All this danger. All this death. And the banker had reached the goal first. Luke looked sick. Mary furious. Ethan remained focused on one thing. Sam. The sheriff nodded. Still alive. Then he smiled again. That smile. Cold. Certain. Victorious. The problem is what happens after midnight. Grace's pulse accelerated. What happens after midnight? McCall looked toward the storm. Toward Miller S. Pass. Toward something terrible. Voss does need hostages once the silver belongs to him. The room froze. Because suddenly everyone understood. Samuel was to leverage anymore. He was a witness. And witnesses had been dying all week. Jacob Turner. The man from the freight office. Others before them. Witnesses. Always witnesses. Grace looked toward Ethan. His face had changed. Not with panic. Not with grief. With decision. The kind of decision that could not be reversed. The sheriff noticed too. Don T. Ethan ignored him. McCall sighed. Mott was afraid of that. Then something unexpected happened. The sheriff removed his revolver. The room tensed instantly. But he didn't point it at them. Instead, he placed it on the table. Nobody understood. Not immediately. McCall looked tired suddenly. Very tired. Like a man carrying too much for too long. 23 years. Silence. The sheriff stared at the map. At the silver. At the secret. That's how long this has been poisoning people. Nobody spoke. Because nobody understood where this was going. McCall laughed once. Bitterly. Do you know who killed Ethan S. father? The warehouse became absolutely silent. Ethan stared. Grace felt her pulse hammering. Because somehow she already knew. The answer mattered. More than anything. The sheriff looked directly at Ethan. Then spoke. Voss S. father. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody even blinked. Because the revelation shattered everything. The hidden claim. The railroad. The deaths. The decades of lies. All of it. Connected. The sheriff continued quietly. The old man discovered Elias Mercer refused to sell. Grace closed her eyes briefly. Of course. Money. Always money. Always greed. Always ownership. McCall nodded. He staged an accident. The words landed like stones. Ethan didn't he move? Didn't he react? Not outwardly. But Grace saw it. The pain. The rage. The understanding. A lifetime of questions suddenly answered. The sheriff looked away. Then Anna found records proving it. The room froze again. Anna. Always Anna. Always returning to the centre. McCall continued. She hid the document. Grace felt her breath catch. The documents. The missing records. The proof. Real proof. Not theory. Not suspicion. Proof. Where? The question escaped Ethan before anyone else could ask. The sheriff smiled sadly. That's the part Voss never figured out. Silence. Then McCall stepped backward. Toward the doorway. Toward the storm. Toward the night. One of the armed men looked confused. So what? The sheriff glanced at him, then drew a second revolver hidden beneath his coat. Everything happened at once. The shot echoed through the warehouse. The armed man collapsed. Dead before he hit the floor. Chaos erupted. Rifles swung wildly. Men shouted. Luke grabbed his weapon. Mary dove for cover. Grace dropped behind the table. And Ethan moved like lightning, because Sheriff McCall had just chosen a side, and the war for the hidden claim had finally begun. Gunfire exploded through the warehouse. Wood splintered. Lantern light shattered. Men shouted over thunder and rain. Grace hit the floor hard as bullets tore through crates behind her. The world became noise, smoke, and chaos. Then Ethan Mercer disappeared into it. Not recklessly. Not blindly. Purposefully. The way a mountain lion moved through trees. The way a father moved toward danger when his child stood on the other side. Sheriff McCall fired twice more. One of Voss' hired men fell. Another dove for cover. Luke Brennan returned fire from behind a stack of freight barrels. Mary Collins grabbed Grace by the arm. Together they crawled behind a collapsed timber beam. The firefight lasted less than 30 seconds. It felt like an hour. When silence finally returned, 3 of Voss' men were dead. 2 had fled into the storm. And Sheriff McCall stood breathing heavily near the doorway. Rain blew through the opening behind him. Blood stained his sleeve. He looked older somehow. Not in years. In burden. Luke rose carefully. You finally grow a conscience? The sheriff laughed bitterly. Don't to give me too much credit. Ethan approached. Slowly. Dangerously. What? McCall met his eyes. Then looked away. Because Voss promised nobody would get hurt. The answer landed hard. Because it sounded honest. Painfully honest. The sheriff continued. Then Jacob died. Silence. Then the freight witness died. More silence. And now a boy. He shook his head. No silver deposit is worth a child. Grace believed him. Not because he deserved trust. Because regret had finally become heavier than greed. McCall reached into his coat, removed a small brass key, and handed it to Ethan. The document. Ethan stared. What document? The sheriff nodded toward the mountains. Anna S. documents. The room froze. Again. Always Anna. Always the missing piece. McCall looked at Grace. Your wife figured it out years ago. The words sounded strange. Your wife. Yet somehow right. Grace felt it too. The sheriff continued. She knew someone inside county records was altering ownership files. Luke swore softly. McCall nodded. She copied every. Grace's pulse quickened. Copies. Always copies. Smart woman. Very smart woman. Where are they? Ethan asked. McCall looked toward the storm, then toward the brass key. Inside your cabin. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Because none of them expected that answer. The roots. Ethan stared. What? McCall nodded. Anna hid a lockbox beneath the third storage shelf. Silence. Absolute silence. The mountain man looked genuinely shocked. Grace understood why. He had lived there for years, walked through that cellar thousands of times, and never knew. McCall smiled sadly. She didn't tell you because she was protecting. The words hurt. Everyone felt it. Especially Ethan. The sheriff continued. If they came looking, you couldn't reveal what you didn't know. Grace slowly understood. Anna hadn't hidden the truth from Ethan because she doubted him. She had hidden it because she loved him. The realization struck harder than anyone expected. Then McCall straightened. The moment ended. Reality returned. Samuel remained missing. Voss remained free. Midnight approached, and somewhere in Miller Pass a frightened 8-year-old boy waited. Ethan closed his hand around the key. Where exactly is Voss? The sheriff looked directly at him. The old mine entrance. Grace exchanged a glance with Mary. The coordinates. The triangle. The hidden claim. Everything led there. McCall nodded. He thinks he Luke checked his rifle. Good. The sheriff frowned. Luke smiled grimly. People make mistakes when they think they For the first time all night. McCall almost smiled. Then they rode. Through rain. Through darkness. Through mountain roads turning to rivers beneath their horses' hooves. Lightning illuminated the ridges. Thunder shook the valleys. The storm felt alive. Angry. As if the mountains themselves wanted this old secret buried forever. Grace rode beside Ethan. Neither spoke much. Words felt unnecessary. Everything important had already been said. Finally, after nearly an hour, Ethan broke the silence. She would like. Grace looked at him. He nodded. The rain hid his expression. But not completely. She hated bullying. Grace felt something tighten in her chest. Not jealousy. Not comparison. Something gentler. Respect. For the woman who had protected truth long after her own death. She sounds remarkable. Ethan nodded once. She was. Then silence returned. Comfortable silence. The kind built through shared danger. Shared trust. Shared purpose. Near midnight they reached Miller Pass. The entrance appeared exactly where Jacob Turner's notes predicted. Hidden among jagged rocks. Nearly invisible. A narrow opening leading into darkness. The old mine. The hidden claim. And beside lanterns. Several of them. Men. Horses. And Samuel. The boy sat tied to a support post near the entrance. Alive. Thank God. Alive. Grace saw Ethan's entire body change. Every muscle. Every breath. Everything. the father overtook the investigator. The husband. The landowner. The mountain man. Only a father remained. Voss stood nearby, dry beneath a canvas shelter. Confident. Victorious. He hadn't seen them yet. Interesting. Very interesting. Luke smiled. Looks like the banker forgot to post enough guards. Mary checked her revolver. Grace unfolded the final surviving map, the one marking the silver deposit, the one everyone had killed for. Then she noticed something. A notation. Tiny. Nearly invisible. Written beside the entrance coordinates. Not silver. Not ore. Not wealth. A warning. Anna S. handwriting. Grace knew immediately because it matched the notes hidden inside the account book. Her breath caught. What? Ethan looked at her. Grace showed him. The words were simple. Only one sentence. But they changed everything. The hidden claim is not the mine. Silence. Thunder. Rain. Shock. Because suddenly they understood. The silver wasn't the secret. Not really. The mine was to the secret. Not really. The claim itself, the legal ownership, that was the real treasure. The documents hidden in the cellar would prove ownership. Legitimate ownership. Enough to destroy Voss. Enough to expose decades of fraud. Enough to win. Grace slowly looked toward the banker. Then toward Samuel. Then toward Ethan. A smile touched her face. Small. Certain. Dangerous. For the first time since this began, they didn't just have a chance. They had the truth. And truth was finally on their side. The war for the hidden claim was about to end. But the battle for Samuel Mercer and for everything Ethan and Grace had built together was only just beginning.